Welcome to Potter Read. Today's adventure. Harry found Merlin's lost spellbook in the Dursleys' attic at age 6 and taught himself battle magic. If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The attic. The attic at number 4 Privet Drive smelled of hot dust and old insulation, and Harry Potter had been sent into it as a punishment. He had not done anything. That was the part the others never bothered with. Dudley had broken the carriage clock on the landing, swung it by its cord like a conker until the glass cracked and the hands sprang loose, and Dudley had pointed one fat finger at Harry, and Aunt Petunia had believed the finger over the boy, because the finger belonged to Dudley and the boy belonged to nobody. So now there was a birthday to prepare for Uncle Vernon's, with paper streamers and a marquee of relatives descending by tea-time, and the box of spare folding chairs lived in the attic, and a 6-year-old was small enough to fit through the hatch. "And don't come down till you found them," Aunt Petunia had said, holding the loft ladder steady with both hands as though she expected him to fall on purpose and stain the carpet. "And don't touch anything. There's nothing up there worth touching." The hatch had shut. Not locked, there was no lock, but the difference in that house was theoretical. Harry sat on his heels on a joist and let his eyes adjust. A single skylight, grimed amber, let down a slab of evening light thick with floating motes. The chairs were not where she'd said. Nothing in that house was ever where anyone said. He could see boxes of Dudley's outgrown clothes, a dead Christmas tree shedding plastic needles, a hat stand with no hats, and a great deal of the particular junk that families keep because throwing it away would mean admitting they had wasted the money in the first place. He was good at looking. It was the one skill the cupboard under the stairs had taught him that the Dursleys had not meant to teach. When you're small and disliked, you learn to read a room before you enter it, where the moods are, where the exits are, which floorboard sings. Harry crawled the length of the attic reading it the way he read everything, by parts and not by faith, and somewhere over the front of the house, past the cold water tank, he found a section the dust had been kind to. There was a gap in the boards there. Someone had lifted them once and set them back not quite flush. He worked his fingers into the seam and lifted, and the board came up with a soft tearing of cobweb, and underneath, wedged into the cavity between the joists where the loft insulation should have been, was a book. It should not have interested him. He had been told there was nothing up there worth touching, and for once that aligned with his own estimate of the Dursleys' possessions. But the book was wrong for the house in a way he couldn't name yet. It was bound in something dark that was not leather and was not cloth, a hide, fine-grained, the color of a riverbed at night, and it had no title on the spine and no title on the cover, and it was warm. That was the thing his hand reported before his eyes could argue. The attic was hot the way attics are hot, a dead trapped heat, and the book was warm a different way, warm like a held hand, warm like something that had a temperature of its own and had been keeping it patiently in the dark for a long time. Harry pulled it free. It was heavier than it looked, and it settled against him as though it had decided to. He turned it in the amber light. The cover gave nothing away. He opened it, blank. Every page blank, not yellowed, not foxed, but a clean dark cream, page after page of nothing, as if the book had been bought to be written in and then abandoned. He held it up to the skylight in case there was something the angle would betray. Nothing. He licked his thumb and rubbed a corner in case of invisible ink, because he had read about invisible ink in a library book and tested the theory once on Aunt Petunia's shopping list to her fury. Nothing came up. So it was an empty book, and he had risked a beating to find an empty book, and the sensible thing was to put it back under the boards and find the chairs. He didn't put it back. He told himself afterward that he couldn't have said why, but that wasn't true. He could have said why. It was warm, and nothing at Privet Drive was ever warm to him. And a 6-year-old who has been cold his whole short life will keep a warm thing for no better reason than that. He held it against his chest with one arm and went on looking for the chairs, and when he found them, stacked behind the water tank exactly where Aunt Petunia had said they were not, he had a problem, which was that he could not carry 4 folding chairs down a loft ladder one-handed, and he did not want to let go of the book. He set it down on the joist to free both hands, and as he reached for the chairs, a splinter from the rough old wood drove up under the nail of his left forefinger. It was a small pain, and he was used to small pains, so he barely made a sound, just a hiss between his teeth and a reflexive shake of the hand. A single dark bead welled up at his fingertip. He put the finger in his mouth out of habit, and with his other hand he reached again for the book to move it clear, and the blood that had not yet reached his mouth fell instead, one drop, no more, onto the open page. The book woke up. He would spend years learning the right words for what happened in the next breath, and he would never find words that were not too small. The drop of blood did not sit on the page. It sank the way rain sinks into dry earth, and where it sank a light spread out from it in fine veins, gold going to white, racing to the 4 corners of the page and then leaping the gutter to the facing page and then onward, page turning itself against page, a wind that came from inside the book and smelled of cold stone and of a sea Harry had never seen. The amber skylight light guttered as if a hand had passed over a candle. The whole attic lined. And the warmth that had been patient became something else, not hotter, but awake, the difference between a banked fire and one that has just been fed and knows it. Words came up out of the page. They did not fade in or print themselves letter by letter. They were simply there between one heartbeat and the next, as though they had always been there, and Harry had been the one who was blank until now. They were not in any alphabet he had been taught, all spurs and ligatures and long descenders like roots, and he could read them. He read them the way you understand a thing in a dream, completely and without the middle steps, and what they said was this: at last, I have been a long time in the dark, and you are very small, and you are exactly who I was left for. Hello, Harry Potter, he should have screamed. A different child would have screamed, or dropped the book, or scrambled for the hat, shouting for an adult, even an adult he hated, because a talking book is a thing outside the edges of the world and children are supposed to find the edges of the world terrifying. Harry did not scream. He had learned in the cupboard that screaming brought the wrong kind of attention and never the right kind, and he had unlearned the reflex so thoroughly that even astonishment came to him quietly. His heart was going hard. His hands, he noticed, were steady. He looked at the words, and then he looked at the page beneath the words where his single drop of blood had vanished without a mark, and he did the thing he always did when the world presented him with something impossible, which was to begin very carefully to find out how it worked. You know my name, he said. His voice in the dust was small and even. Aunt Petunia keeps the post. There's nothing in this house with my name on it. So either you got it from me just now, or somebody told you a long time ago. The light in the veins of the page pulsed once, and he had the unmistakable sense that he had pleased it. Somebody told me a long time ago, the words said, dissolving and reforming. Two somebodies who held me last in hands that loved you, and who set me here for the day your blood would wake me. They are not here to tell you the rest. I am hands that loved you. Harry had been told by Aunt Petunia, with her mouth pulled thin, that his mother and father had been a pair of jobless drunks who had died in a car crash and left him to be a burden on decent people. He had believed roughly none of it for roughly 2 years, on the evidence that Aunt Petunia lied about small things constantly, and was therefore unlikely to be reliable about large ones, but he had never had anything to put in the lie's place. He looked at the words now and felt something move in his chest that he had no use for and no time for, and he set it down where he could not see it and went on with the work. What are you? A book, the words said, and there was something almost like humor in the way the light moved. That much is true. I am a book of workings of the old craft, the craft from before the wands and the schools and the careful little rules they wrote to make themselves feel safe. I am very old. I have had one keeper at a time for longer than your country has had a name, and now I have you. Workings, Harry repeated. Spells, spells. He was quiet for a moment. Below him, faintly, through the loft floor, he could hear Aunt Petunia's voice raised at the back door and Dudley's whine answering it, and the ordinary machinery of the house grinding on, oblivious, 4 feet beneath a thing that had no business existing. The smallness of them struck him. They had sent him up here to punish him, and they had handed him this. Show me one, Harry said. The light went still. When the words came again, they came slower, and he understood that he was being weighed. You asked quickly. Most who held me asked first what I would give them. You asked to be shown. That is the better question and the more dangerous one, so know this before I answer it. What is in me is not the conjuring of pleasant lights for children. It is the craft of those who fought to live in a harder world than yours, and it will do you harm if you are careless with it, and it will draw harm to you if you are seen using it, and you are a boy in a house that already wishes you smaller than you are. If I teach you, you carry it alone in the dark, where no one can take it from you, and no one can help you with it. Do you understand what that costs? Yes, Harry said, and did not have to think about it, because alone in the dark, where no one could take it from him, was the only place he had ever owned anything. Show me, then look, said the book, and want it. The page cleared. A single word stood at its center, that Rutanspur script, and beneath the word, the way a recipe sits beneath its name, lay a knowing that poured into Harry whole, not instructions in a line he could read off, but a shape, a way of holding his attention, a place to push from that sat somewhere behind his breastbone, lower than his thoughts. The word was lumen, light. And the shape of the working was this: that light is not a thing you make but a thing you call, and that to call it you must be perfectly clear about wanting it and perfectly empty of doubting it, and that the two together, the wanting and the not doubting, are the whole of the craft and the labor of a life. He tried. He held his pricked finger up before his face in the dim attic, and he gathered the wanting, which was easy. He had wanted things his whole life. Then he reached for the not doubting and could not find it, because of course he doubted. A sensible boy doubts that light will come out of his finger, and the doubt sat in the way like a stone in a doorway, and nothing happened. He breathed. He tried again. Nothing. A third time, and on the third time he felt something gather and catch and then slip, like a fish coming to the hand and twisting off, and he opened his eyes to find a faint smear of gray-gold luminescence dying on the air an inch from his fingertip, already gone before he was sure he'd seen it. He had seen it. The thing that moved in him then was not joy, or not only joy. It was the cleaner, colder pleasure of a closed loop, The click of a thing that works, the feeling he got on the rare occasions the world made sense on his terms. He had a variable now. He had made the light fail in a particular way, the wanting present and the doubting present, and the working had gone exactly as far as the doubt had led it and not 1 inch further. It's the doubting, he said aloud to the book. I have to stop the doubting, but I can't just decide to believe a stupid thing. So I have to make it not stupid, I have to already know it's going to happen. The light in the page surged so bright that for an instant the whole attic was washed white, and the words that came were the closest thing to delight that dark old hide could manage. In 1,000 years, the book said, I have never had a keeper find that in an hour. You will do. Oh, you will do very well. Again, child, not because you doubt, because you have decided, and a thing decided is no longer in question. Again, Harry tried again. And again, the square of skylight light crept across the boards and reddened and began to fail, and 4 folding chairs stood forgotten behind the water tank, and a 6-year-old sat cross-legged in the dust with his finger raised before his face like a small priest at a small altar, failing and failing and failing better. On the 9th attempt he was counting, he counted everything, he stopped trying to believe and simply remembered. He remembered the gray gold smear that had already happened once, that was real, that he had seen with his own eyes, and he did not ask the light to come, he welcomed it back, the way you'd welcome a thing that had only stepped out of the room. And the light came. It sat on the tip of his forefinger, a bead of cold radiance the size of a pea, steady and gold-white and entirely his. It threw his shadow huge and trembling up the slope of the roof. It lit the dust hanging in the air so that he sat in a slow gold snowfall of it. It did not flicker, it did not die. He turned his hand and it stayed, obedient, a thing he had called out of nothing in the dark and into the world, and the world had let him. He looked at it for a long time and he did not smile, because smiling was a thing he did for other people when it was safer to, and there was no one here, and so his face simply did what it wanted, which was to go very still and very open, the face of someone seeing the first thing they have ever owned outright. Mine, he said. Yours, the book agreed. He did not stop there. A thing that came when called could be asked to do more than come, and Harry had never in his life been handed a working object without taking it apart to see how far it went. He held the bead of light steady in thought, deliberately brighter, and it flared hot white, throwing the rafters into hard relief and stinging his eyes, and he thought dimmer and it sank to a cold glow that barely showed his own knuckles. He moved it. He had been holding it at his fingertip out of an unexamined assumption that the finger was where it lived, and he tested the assumption the way he tested everything and found it false. The light would sit on his palm, on the back of his hand, in the air a hand's breadth from his skin, anywhere he set his attention and held the wanting. It was not the finger. It had never been the finger. The finger was only where he had first believed. You are not casting a spell, the book said, and the light in its veins matched the rhythm of the one on his hand, the two of them pulsing together like a thing in its echo. You think you are. You think there is a word and a gesture and a result, the way the wand schools will one day try to teach you in their rows with their marks out of 10. There is not. There is only your will made exact and the world consenting to it. The word is a handle, the blood is a key, the craft is the exactness. Forget that and you will be a conjurer of party tricks. Remember it, and there is very little in time that you will not be able to ask the world to do. Harry turned the cold glow over on his palm and considered the words very little that you will not be able to ask the world to do, and a colder, larger thought arrived behind them, that the people in the house below him had spent 6 years asking the world to keep him small, and the world had consented, and now here was a different way of asking, and the world was consenting to that too. He did not follow the thought to its end. He was 6. But he marked where it went, and the place it went was somewhere he had never been allowed before, which was the belief that the arrangement of his life was not a law of nature, but only a thing that happened to be true for now. The light went out not because he willed it, but because Aunt Petunia's voice came up through the floor like a knife through paper, screeching his name, demanding the chairs, asking what in the name of everything decent he could possibly be doing up there for the better part of an hour, and the doubt rushed back in on the heels of the fear and snuffed the working dead. The attic was abruptly only an attic, hot and dim and ordinary, and Harry was abruptly only a boy who was about to be in trouble. He moved fast. He had always been fast when it counted. He shut the book, and the warmth of it pressed against his palms like a thing reluctant to be shut, and he looked once at the gap in the boards where it had waited however many years for him, and he made the first real decision of the life he was about to start living, which was that it was not going back under the boards. It was coming with him. It was his, and you did not put a thing you owned back in the dark for other people to step over. There was nowhere to hide a book on a boy who owned nothing and was searched by spite on a whim. But Harry had spent 6 years studying the blind spots of number 4 the way a prisoner studies the gaps between the bars, and he knew that the cupboard under the stairs, his cupboard, the one place in the house no one with any pride would ever willingly put their hand into, had a loose section of skirting behind the camp bed where the understair void went back into true dark. He had hidden a marble there once, and a key once, and a square of chocolate once, and nobody had ever found any of them. He dragged the 4 folding chairs to the hatch. He went down the ladder one trip at a time, the chairs first clattering to give Aunt Petunia something to shout about that was not the right thing. And on the last trip he came down with the book held flat against his stomach under his too big jumper, his arm crossed over it as though he were holding a stomachache, which he had learned adults will look away from rather than investigate. Aunt Petunia was waiting at the foot of the ladder with her arms folded and her neck stretched to its full censorious length. "An hour," she said, "an hour to fetch 4 chairs. Were you asleep up there? Were you breaking things?" "They were behind the water tank," Harry said, which was true and therefore steadier than a lie. "It was dark, I couldn't see." Her eyes went over him, the dust graying his jumper, the cobweb in his hair, the hand pressed to his middle and snagged for one bad second on the hand. "What's that? What have you got?" "Splinter," Harry said, and held up his left forefinger, where the splinter genuinely was, the dark bead of dried blood still crowning the nail. He had not had to manufacture the evidence, he had only had to choose which true thing to show her. It was a principle he was discovering that hour and would build a life on, that the strongest lie is a fence built entirely out of true planks, with the gate left where you want it. Aunt Petunia recoiled from the blood as though it might leap the gap to her. "Don't get it on the carpet, don't get it on anything. Go and put a plaster on it and stay out of the way. The Palkases are here at 6 and I won't have you underfoot." She was already turning, already losing interest, the boy and his small wounds dropping out of her attention as they always did the moment they stopped being a problem she had to hold. "Useless," she said to no one, to the hallway, to the general fact of him. Honestly, useless boy. Harry went down the hall to the cupboard under the stairs and let himself in and pulled the door to, and in the slatted dark with the household roaring on outside it, the bell going, Uncle Vernon's voice booming greeting at the Palkases, Dudley thundering down to be admired, he knelt on the thin mattress and worked the loose skirting free and slid the warm book back into the dark, but a different dark, his dark, the only territory in the world that was his to keep. He sat back on his heels. Through the slats a bar of hall light fell across his face. He raised his left forefinger in front of it, the wounded one, and in the noise and the dark where no one would ever look, he remembered the gray-gold light and welcomed it back. It came. Small and steady and gold-white, sitting on the tip of his finger, lighting the underside of the stairs, lighting the spiders and the dust and the marble he'd never moved, lighting the still, intent face of a boy who had been told all his life that he was nothing and had just discovered alone in the dark that he was the one the old thing had waited for. "Useless," Harry said very softly, trying the word out against the light, and found that for the first time it did not fit, and let it fall. Outside, the party began. He could have lain still and listened to it, the way he usually spent the hours when the house was full and he was meant to be invisible, tracking the adults by their voices, knowing without seeing exactly where Uncle Vernon stood by the volume of his laugh. Instead, he used the cover of it. A house loud with company is a house that has stopped watching its cupboard, and Harry had perhaps 2 hours before anyone remembered he existed, and he did not intend to waste them on listening. He set himself a question because a question was how he worked. Could he make the light without the finger, without the blood, without anything but the wanting? The blood had woken the book, but the book was on the other side of the skirting now, shut, and the light had come to his palm in here all the same. So the blood was the key to the book, not to the working. He thought that was probably true. He decided to find out if it was. He cleared his mind of everything but the welcome and called the light to the empty air above the mattress, touching nothing. It came slower, fainter, as though distance from his skin cost it something, but it came, a gray-gold bead hanging in the dark of the cupboard with no finger under it at all. He let himself feel the closed-loop click of it, and then methodically made it harder. He called a second bead beside the first and held both, and the holding of 2 was not twice as hard but 4 times, the effort climbing faster than the count, and that was data 2. He let 1 go. He moved the survivor in a slow circle around the cupboard, lighting the coats on their hooks, the meter, the underside of the stairs that made the ceiling of his whole world, and he learned the shape of his own prison better in 5 lit minutes than he had in 6 dark years. Then he made it fail on purpose. He deliberately let a sliver of doubt back and pictured Aunt Petunia's face, the men in white coats Uncle Vernon threatened the neighbors with, and watched the light gutter and shrink in exact proportion to the fear, and held it there trembling at the edge of going out, and then pushed the fear back down and watched it steady. He did that 3 times. He was not playing. He was finding the throttle, learning by feel where the wanting met the doubting, so that one day, if he ever had to make light in a moment of real fear, he would know precisely how hard to push to keep it lit. A boy who learns a thing only when it is easy will lose it the first time it is hard, and Harry had decided, somewhere in the last 2 hours, that he was not going to lose this. Above his head the party thumped and roared, Dudley's cousins shrieking, a glass breaking to general laughter, the whole oblivious warmth of a family that was not his. He lay under it in the dark with a light circling his hand like a tame star and felt, for once, not shut out of something but shut in with something, and that was the one beat he let himself have, stated once, before he set it down and went back to the work. He drew the book back out of the dark behind the skirting, because there was one experiment left that the party's cover gave him time for, and it was the most important one. He did not yet know whether the book was his or only with him. The difference mattered more than anything. A thing that was with him could be taken, found in a search, confiscated on a whim, lifted out of the cupboard by an adult hand, and carried off to wherever the Dursleys sent the things they did not want him to have. A thing that was truly his, keyed to him the way the words had hinted, was a thing no search could turn into a loss, and Harry had owned so little in his life that had not been taken that he needed to know, tonight, which kind of thing he was holding. He held a light to it and looked at it properly for the first time. By the steady gold the binding gave up a little more than it had in the attic's failing amber. The dark hide was worked in a pattern almost too fine to see, not stamped but grown, like the grain in a leaf, and there were no maker's marks anywhere on it, no title, no clasp, no number, none of the small, honest evidence that an ordinary book carries of the hands that made it and the shop that sold it. It was as though it had never been made at all, only found, the way you find a stone shaped exactly to your palm and cannot quite believe no one carved it. He tested the warmth first, because the warmth was the thing he trusted least. It would be easy to imagine warmth in a thing he wanted so badly to be special, and Harry distrusted the things he wanted, on principle, more than the things he feared. So he set the book down on the cold lino and pressed both his palms flat to the floor until they ached with the chill of it, and counted to 100, and then laid one cold hand on the book and the other on the wall beside it. The wall was cold. The book was warm, warmer than his chilled hand, warmer than the close August night, warm with a heat that had a source somewhere inside the dark hide and was not borrowed from the room or from him. Real, then, not imagined. He noted it and trusted it now, because he had tried to prove it false and failed. Then he did the thing he had been working up to. He tipped the book at an angle to the light, slowly, watching the cover the way he watched a face, and on the third angle he found it. Under the worked grain, only visible when the gold fell aslant, a line of the Rutan spur script was pressed into the hide so faintly that no ordinary eye in any ordinary light would ever catch it. Letters, a word, or a name. He could not read it. The knowing that had poured into him for Lumen did not come for this. The book gave him the workings whole and left this one thing locked, but he understood, looking at the hidden line that surfaced only under his own called light, that the book had a name, an old one, written where only its keeper, holding its own fire at the right angle, would ever find it, and that the name was being kept from him on purpose, the way a thing is kept that has to be earned. "You've got a name," he said softly, "and you won't tell me yet." The gold woke under his hand, faint and pleased. "I have a name, and you have just found the place where it is written, which not one keeper in 10 ever thinks to look for. You cannot read it tonight. You are not large enough to hold it. A thing's true name is the largest thing it owns, and I will not give you mine until you can carry it. But you found it. That is enough for tonight. That is more than enough." Harry looked at the hidden name a moment longer and let it be unread, because he had already learned, in the space of one evening, the rhythm of this book, that it withheld nothing out of spite and everything out of measure, that the locked things were not locked against him but ahead of him, waiting at heights he had not yet climbed to. And then he asked the question that was the whole point of the experiment, the one that decided whether he had found a possession or only a loan. "If someone took you," he said. "If they found you and carried you off, would you still be mine?" "A drop of your blood woke me," the book said, "and no drop of any other blood in the world will ever wake me again. They could carry the shut husk of me to the ends of the earth and never turn a single page to anything but blank. I would be a dead weight of old hide in a stranger's hands, and I would wait a year, 100 years, however long it took, until your blood found me again, because I do not answer to whoever holds me. I answer to you. I have only ever answered to you. You did not find a book tonight, Harry Potter. You found the one thing in the whole of your life that cannot be taken from you, because it is not yours the way a coat is yours. It is yours the way your own hand is yours." Harry knelt in the cupboard with the warm book under his cold palm and the party roaring on above his head, and he held that the one thing that could not be taken at exactly its own size, and did not let it grow into the things it wanted to grow into, and then he slid the book back into the dark behind the skirting, satisfied. He had his answer. He had not found a loan. He had found a possession, the first true one, keyed to his blood and answering to no one else alive, and a boy who has spent his whole life having things taken had just learned that there was now, at last, one thing in the world that the taking could not reach. Inside the cupboard, the air of Merlin, though he did not yet know the name, and would not for a long time, held his light and began to plan. He thought about it like this. The light had failed 8 times and worked once, and then worked again the moment he'd found the trick of it, which meant the trick was real and repeatable and not luck. That was the first thing he knew, and the most important. This was not a thing that happened to him, like the strange things that sometimes happened when he was frightened, the time he'd ended up on the school roof, the time Aunt Petunia's haircut had grown back overnight. Those things had used him. This he used. The hand was his, and the choosing was his, and the light came when he called and stopped when he doubted. And a thing that obeys rules is a thing you can master, given enough dark hours and no one watching, and Harry Potter had nothing in the world but dark hours and no one watching. He thought about exposure because he was 6 and not stupid, and he had grasped already, from the book's warning and from his own long study of the Dursleys, that to be caught doing this would be worse than any beating. He had no clear idea yet what they would do: send him away, lock the cupboard for good, call the men in the white coats Uncle Vernon was always threatening Mrs. Nextdoor with, but he understood the shape of the danger without the detail. A boy who can make light in the dark is a boy who is not nothing, and the entire architecture of his life at number 4 rested on his being nothing. Reveal the light and the architecture would come down, and he did not yet know what it would land on. So, secret. Total secret. He would learn it as he had learned everything the Dursleys forbade, in the gaps, in the dark, under the cover of being beneath notice. And he thought last, before the light wavered, and he let it go and lay down on the thin mattress with his cheek near the warm book behind the skirting, about the thing the words had said: hands that loved you. He had been given, in the space of an hour, a thing that called itself a gift from his dead parents, and proof in his own hand that the gift was real, and the proof was worth more to him than the gift, because the proof meant the rest of it might be true as well, that there had been hands once that had held him without wanting him smaller. He did not cry, because crying was a thing that happened to other boys, boys who had someone to cry to. He lay in the dark and let the one thought sit in him, stated once, and then set it aside, because there was work to do and feeling did not do it. Tomorrow there would be more pages. He knew this the way he'd known the script, completely, without the middle steps. The book had said, "You will do very well," and the book, unlike everyone else he had ever known, did not seem to be in the habit of saying things it did not mean. He fell asleep with his bandaged hand curled under his chin and the wall warm at his back, and for the first time in his memory he was not waiting for the morning to be over before it began. He was waiting for it to come. In the night the house ticked and settled. The Palkises went home tipsy at 11. Uncle Vernon snored. Aunt Petunia lay awake a while with the obscure unease of a woman who has felt a draught from a door she was sure was shut, and could not have said what had disturbed her, and put it down to the wine, and slept. And behind the skirting in the cupboard under the stairs, in the true dark, the Aurelian Codex lay warm against the wall beside the sleeping boy, and turned very slowly of its own accord one blank page into a written one, readying the next lesson, the way a patient thing readies what it has waited 1,000 years to give, so that when Harry Potter woke, the light would already be there, waiting to be welcomed back. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. Self-taught, he woke before the alarm clock in the kitchen, before Aunt Petunia's slippers found the lino, in the gray hour when number 4 belonged to no one. He had trained himself to it without meaning to. The cupboard had no window, but his body had learned the house so completely that he knew the hour from the temperature of the air and the particular silence, and the hour he wanted was this one, the hour with no eyes in it. He worked the skirting free and drew out the book. It opened to a page that had not been there the night before. He had half expected it and was unsettled anyway, not by the writing, but by the fact that the writing had happened while he slept, an arm's length from his face, the book busy in the dark on the other side of a board. He held the thought a moment and then released it, because a tool that improved itself overnight was a better tool, not a worse one, and fear of a thing you intend to use is a luxury for people with other options. The new page held a single word in the Rutanspur script, and beneath it the shape of a working poured into him the way Lumen had, Silch, a circle, not a circle drawn on the floor, a circle hung in the air around a thing, a skin of held intention, a keeping out. The knowing arrived complete, and the labor arrived with it, because the shape told him at once that this would be harder than light by an order he could feel. Light was a thing you welcomed. The circle was a thing you insisted on and went on insisting on against a world that did not want to be told where its edges were. You will want this one, the word said, the gold moving slow. A boy with a secret needs a wall more than he needs a candle, but understand what I am giving you. The light obeyed because light is generous. The circle will not obey. It must be held every moment it stands by a will that does not tire and does not blink. Most who tried me gave it up. They wanted the wall to stand on its own, the way their bodies stand without being told to. It will not. It is yours only for as long as you are paying for it. How long can you hold it? Harry asked. That is the right question, and the answer is the work of years. Today you will hold it for the length of a breath. Begin. He began. He set the book on his knees and put his attention out into the air in front of him and tried to insist on a boundary there, a curve, a held shape here and no closer. For a long moment there was nothing but the strain of it, like pushing on a door with no handle. Then the air an arm's length out went faintly, wrongly solid, a tension he could feel against the fine hairs of his arm, a place where the cupboard's dead air stopped being dead, and he had it. A curved sheet of held nothing standing between him and the cupboard door, and the holding of it cost him so much so fast that sweat sprang on his lip and his vision narrowed and the circle collapsed in under 2 seconds, and he sat there in the dark breathing as though he'd run. 2 seconds, he noted it. He noted the sweat, the narrowed vision, the particular place behind his sternum where the cost was paid, lower and deeper than where the light was paid for. He noted that the circle had wanted to be round and he had let it be lopsided, and that the lopsidedness had been part of why it fell, because a shape held wrong fights you the whole time you hold it. He did it again. Round this time, or rounder. 2 seconds became 3. The book said nothing, and he understood after a dozen attempts that the silence was deliberate. When he had found the trick of the light, the page had blazed with something like joy. Now, with the circle, the book lay quiet on his knees and watched him fail and did not help, and he worked out why. There was no trick to the circle, no insight that would unlock it in an hour. There was only the holding, and the holding could not be taught, only done 1,000 times, until the will that did it grew the muscle the work required. The book had gone quiet because there was nothing to say that he did not already have to find out with his own sweat. A teacher that talked through this would be lying to him, and the book he was learning did not lie. He got it to 5 seconds before the kitchen lino creaked under Aunt Petunia's slippers, and he had the book behind the skirting and his eyes shut in counterfeit sleep before her voice came down the hall to bang on the cupboard door and tell the useless boy to get up and mind the bacon. That was the first morning. There were 200 mornings like it, and he remembered almost all of them, because he counted everything, and because each one cost him something he could feel himself paying. He built a method because method was the only thing he had ever found that made the world behave. He could not write his results down, paper was searched, and a notebook in the cupboard was a confession waiting to be read, so he kept the ledger in his head, and the head was good enough, better than good, sharpened by years of having nowhere safe to set anything down. He logged the circle's duration each morning the way another boy might log a high score, 5 seconds, 8. On the worst mornings, when he'd slept badly or Uncle Vernon's mood the night before had left a residue of fear in him, 4, and the 4-second mornings taught him more than the 8, because they showed him exactly how much the work depended on a steadiness he did not always own. He found the variables and turned them one at a time, the only honest way to learn anything. Did the circle hold longer with his eyes open or shut? Shut at first, open later, once he'd stopped needing the dark to believe in it, and open was the prize, because a wall you could only hold with your eyes shut was no wall at all in the moment you'd need one. Did it hold longer round or lopsided? Round. Did it hold longer near his body or far? Near. Could he make it small, a circle the size of his 2 hands cupped together, and hold that longer than the big one? Yes, much longer, the cost scaling with the size the way the second light had cost 4 times the first, and so he learned to make the wall no bigger than the thing it had to keep, which was a principle the book confirmed only once, dryly, weeks in. Now you have found the law that the wand schools spend 7 years failing to teach. Never spend more of yourself than the work requires. The rest is detail. He kept turning variables long after a less stubborn boy would have stopped. Did the circle care which way he faced? No. Did it care whether he was afraid? Yes, fear made it harder to start and easier to hold once started, as though terror were a poor fuel that nonetheless burned. Could he hold the circle and a light at the same time? Not at first. The 2 works fought for the same narrow channel of his attention, and both guttered. But by the 3rd week of trying, he found that the trick was not to split his attention between them, but to stop thinking of them as 2 things, to hold a single intention, light inside a wall, and let the one will carry both. And when that worked the first time, he sat very still in the dark and understood that he had just learned something the book had not told him, found a law on the far side of the laws the book gave, and that the finding was his. The book confirmed it, and the gold moved warm. Yes. They are not spells, child, I told you that the first hour. They are one thing wearing different faces, and the master does not cast 2 workings, he holds one will that does 2 works. You are running ahead of me. Good, run. By the end of summer, he could hold a circle the size of a dinner plate for the better part of a minute with his eyes open, standing, while reciting Dudley's favorite cartoons in his head, to prove to himself that the holding had become something his will could do in the background, the way a man can walk and talk at once. He tested it by failing it on purpose, the way he tested everything, let his attention slip mid-recitation and felt the wall go and caught it again before it fell, learning the exact texture of the catch so that catching would be a reflex before he ever needed the reflex. A wall that fell when you were surprised was no wall, and he intended, when the day came that he needed one, to be holding a wall that did not know how to fall. The garden shed became his second cupboard. Uncle Vernon never went into it. It held the mower and a great deal of guilt about projects unstarted, and on the long light summer evenings when the Dursleys were planted in front of the television, Harry was supposed to be weeding, and he wove the weeding through the work so that the beds did genuinely get weeded, and no one ever asked what else he had been doing for 3 hours behind the runner beans. He was always, by then, doing 2 things at once and showing only the harmless one. It was becoming the organizing principle of his life. The near miss came in August, and it taught him a lesson he had been arrogant enough to think he did not need. He had grown comfortable. Comfort was the enemy, and he knew it in theory and had let himself forget it in practice, because 2 months of unbroken success had quietly convinced him that the gray hour was inviolable, that no one in that house would ever rise before him. So on a close, sleepless August night, he did not wait for the gray hour. He drew the book out at 1 in the morning, restless, wanting the work the way another child wants sugar, and he was 3 minutes into a circle with a light caged inside it, the whole cupboard lit gold, his face lit gold, the book open and glowing on his knees when the cupboard door was wrenched open from outside. It was Dudley. Only Dudley in his pajamas, come down for a midnight raid on the biscuit tin and drawn by the line of light under the cupboard door. He stood there blinking, fat and stupid with sleep, staring at his cousin sitting in a cupboard full of golden light with an open book glowing on his knees, and for one suspended second the whole architecture of Harry's secret hung on what a 6-year-old bully would do next. Harry did not panic. He had spent 200 mornings building a will that did not blink, and it did not blink now. He killed the light not slowly, not with a flinch, but cleanly, the way he'd practiced killing it 1,000 times, so that between one of Dudley's blinks and the next the cupboard went black. And in the dark, in the flat bored voice he used on Dudley, the voice that gave a bully nothing to push against, he said, "Torch, I was reading. Go back to bed before you wake your dad." It worked because it was almost true, and because Dudley was stupid, and because Dudley, more than anything, did not want to be the one who woke Uncle Vernon at 1 in the morning. He stood a moment longer, the afterimage of gold fading on his dull face, and then the appetite for biscuits won over the appetite for trouble, and he turned and padded off to the kitchen. And Harry sat in the black cupboard with his heart going like a hammer and the book cooling on his knees, and learned, in the worst possible way, the thing he should have learned for free. That the gray hour was a discipline, not a law, and that the difference between a secret kept and a secret blown was sometimes a single night of wanting the work too badly to wait for it. The book wrote nothing that night, but in the morning the readied page held one line and the gold was cold. "You were lucky. Luck is a debt. Do not borrow against it again." He read it and did not argue because it was right, and the next night when the wanting came, he held a circle in the dark with no light in it at all, and proved to himself that he could do the work blind in the true dark, where no line of gold would ever show beneath a door again. The third working came in September, and it frightened him, which was useful because it taught him that the book would give him things he was not ready to be careless with. The page said G-res, heat. The shape of it was an ember coaxed out of the air itself, a gathering of warmth into a point, and the knowing came with a warning braided through it that he felt as clearly as the working. That heat, unlike light, did not stay where it was put. Light sat, heat spread and climbed and fed, and a heat called carelessly into a shed full of dry timber and a petrol can was not a working at all but a fire with a witness. He did not practice it in the shed. He practiced it in the bath, the one place in the house with a lock on the door and a great deal of water within reach. On the Sunday evenings he was permitted 10 cold minutes after Dudley had used all the hot. He sat in 3 inches of cooling water and coaxed an ember into being a hand's breadth above the surface, the smallest he could make, no bigger than a match head, and learned its appetites where a single cupped hand of water could end it. It wanted to grow. The instant he gave it the least slack it reached, brightening, hungering, and he learned to hold it starved, exactly the size he meant and not a thread bigger, and the holding of a hungry thing exactly was a different discipline from the holding of the patient circle, and it taught him a different muscle entirely. He turned its variables too, because frightened was not the same as careless. He learned that the ember answered faster than the light or the circle, that heat came eager where the wall came grudging, and he understood the asymmetry the moment he felt it. The world was always more willing to be given destruction than order. It took a held will to make a wall. It took barely a thought to make a fire. That was a law and an ugly one, and he marked it, because the laws that were ugly were the ones most worth knowing in advance. The book, when he reported what he'd done, he had taken to reporting in the gray mornings, because thinking aloud to a thing that understood had become the nearest he had to company, said only, "Good, you feared it, keep fearing it. The keeper who stops fearing the fire is the keeper I outlive." He asked it questions in those mornings and learned the shape of what it would and would not answer. It would tell him the workings. It would tell him, when he found a law for himself, whether the law was true. It would not tell him what it was for, or who had made it, or why it had been left in a Surrey attic for a boy with a cupboard. And when he pushed at those edges, the gold went still, and the page said the same thing each time in the same words, so that he came to hear them as a closed door. "Not yet. You are not large enough to be told, and I will not pour the sea into a cup and call it a gift. Grow. The telling will fit you when you are big enough to hold it." He stopped pushing. He let the closed door be and stacked it with the other things he could not yet open, and went on growing toward it, because growing toward it was the one instruction the book gave him that he did not have to be told twice. There was a morning in October when the book taught him by refusing him. He had come to the cupboard wanting the next working. He could feel that there was one, the readied page had a weight to it, a fullness, the sense of a thing waiting behind the cream of the paper, and he was impatient for it, because he had mastered the ember and the wall and the light, and he wanted the next rung. He drew the book out and opened it and found the page blank. Not closed door blank, not yet blank. Simply withheld, the fullness sitting just behind the paper where he could feel it and not reach it. "Why won't you give it to me?" he said, and heard the want in his own voice and disliked it. "Because you want it," the book said. "You want it the way you wanted the work at 1 in the morning in August, and a boy who takes a working because he wants it will use it the same way. The next thing I have for you can hurt people. I will not put it in a hand that is reaching. Show me a hand that is still." He sat with that. It made him angry, and he let the anger run its course because pretending he was not angry would have been its own kind of sloppiness, and when it had run out he found the book was right, which was the thing about the book that he had come to rely on and to resent in roughly equal measure. It was right, and it did not care whether being right was comfortable, so he did not take the working. He closed the book and put it away and held a wall in the dark with no light in it for the length of time it took the anger to go all the way down, and he came back the next morning not reaching, and the morning after that, and on the third morning the page filled while he watched, the gold flowing into the root and spur shapes, and the working that came into him was the one the book had been holding back, and he understood that he had been given it not as a reward for waiting, but as a consequence of having become. In 3 days a slightly different boy, one whose hand was still. He marked that too. The book did not give him things, it gave him to himself, a piece at a time, and handed him the workings only once the boy who held them was a boy it could trust to hold them. What changed across that autumn was not only what he could do, it was what he was. He had begun the summer as a thing the house defined, the useless boy, the burden, the freak who made his aunt's hair grow back, and somewhere in the 200 mornings the definition had stopped reaching him. They still said the words still landed, but they landed now on a surface that was not the whole of him, because the whole of him included a boy who could hold a wall in the air with his eyes open, and that boy did not live in their house at all. He lived in the gray hour and the shed and the 3 inches of cooling bathwater, in a country they could not find and did not know was there. He let himself feel that once, on a gray morning in October, with a circle the size of a dinner plate standing steady in the dark, and then he set it down and went on, because feeling it twice would have made it a comfort, and a comfort was a thing you leaned on, and he did not yet trust anything enough to lean. The cupboard was searched in November, and it taught Harry that a hiding place is only as good as the day someone decides to look. It was Uncle Vernon who did it, and he did it for no reason that had anything to do with Harry, which was the frightening part. A neighbor's shed had been broken into and a strimmer taken, and Vernon, who lived in a permanent low terror of the world's disorder reaching his own tidy patch of it, had got it into his head that things were going missing closer to home, and had announced over Sunday lunch that he would be conducting an inspection of the garage, the shed, and that cupboard, with a jerk of his fork toward the hall, since heaven knows what he's been squirreling away in there. Harry, eating his smaller portion in his corner, did not look up and did not stop chewing, and inside the worn thin boy the other one went very still and very fast. The book was behind the skirting. The skirting was good, it had held a marble and a key and a square of chocolate against years of casual spite, but it had never been tested against a man on his hands and knees with a purpose, and Vernon Dursley with a purpose was a different animal from Vernon Dursley with a grievance. A purposeful search would find the loose section. Harry knew it would because he had found it himself, and what one person can find another can find, and the only question was whether he had the 2 hours before the inspection to make finding it not matter. He had the 2 hours, he used them. He could not move the book out of the house, there was nowhere safer than the cupboard, which was the whole grim joke of his life. He could not make the skirting unloose. So he did the thing he had been learning all autumn to do with every danger, which was to give the searcher exactly the small dull truth that would stop him looking for the large one. He spent the 2 hours building a decoy. Behind the loose skirting in front of the book, in the part of the dark cavity a kneeling man's hand would reach first, he arranged a hoard not of anything valuable which would invite questions, but of exactly the pathetic small contraband a despised boy might be expected to squirrel away. A heel of bread saved against hunger, 3 pilfered sugar cubes, a chipped toy soldier of Dudley's rescued from a bin, a pencil stub, a boiled sweet. The hoard of a child who had nothing and hid scraps. He set it where the hand would close on it, and he set the book behind it and below it, pushed back into the true dark where the warmth would read, to a casual touch, as nothing but the wall. When Uncle Vernon came red-faced, breathing hard, lowering himself to his knees in the hall with the air of a man performing an unpleasant civic duty, he pulled the camp bed aside and ran his thick hands along the skirting and found the loose section in under a minute, exactly as Harry had known he would, and reached into the dark, and his fingers closed on the hoard. Harry watched his uncle's face from the hall and arranged his own into the precise expression the moment required, which was not innocence. Innocence would have been a lie Vernon could smell, but the hot, cornered, humiliated shame of a boy whose pitiful secret stash has just been found. He let his face crumple exactly that much. He looked at the floor. And Uncle Vernon drew out the heel of bread and the sugar cubes and the chipped soldier and the pencil stub, and held them in his great pink hand, and understood them completely, because they confirmed everything he already believed. That the boy was a furtive, hoarding, ungrateful little thief who squirreled away scraps in the dark like a rat. Stealing sugar, Vernon said with enormous satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man whose low opinion of the world has been gratifyingly proved. Stealing food out of my kitchen and hiding it like a Petunia. Petunia, come and look what your nephew's been at. and the inspection was over because Vernon had found what an inspection of Harry's cupboard was supposed to find: proof of the boy's badness, and a man who has found what he came for does not keep digging behind it. He never reached past the hoard. His hand, an inch from the warm hide of the lost book of Merlin, had closed on a stolen sugar cube and been satisfied, and he heaved himself up and went to enjoy the small, clean pleasure of a punishment richly deserved, and the book lay in the dark, an inch behind the place his fingers had stopped, unfound. Harry took the punishment, a clip round the ear, the loss of 2 days' meals he could afford to lose, a lecture about gratitude he did not hear a word of, and he took it the way he took everything now, on the worn thin surface, while underneath the other boy noted the lesson and turned it over and put it away whole. The lesson was not the skirting failed. The skirting had done exactly what he asked of it. The lesson was the one the book had been teaching him in every working, written now in his own blood, that the strongest hiding place is never a place at all. It is a story. Vernon had found the loose board. The board had not saved him. What had saved him was the decoy, the smaller, sadder, more believable secret laid in front of the true one, so that the searcher stopped at the lie he expected and never reached the truth he could not imagine. A hidden thing invites a search. A found thing ends one. From that November, Harry never again trusted a hiding place to be unfindable. He trusted instead that whoever found his hiding place would find, waiting there for them, exactly the disappointing little truth that would send them away satisfied, and behind it, always in the true dark, the thing that was actually his. He told the book that night by the light of a starved gold bead, and the gold moved warm with something close to laughter. "You fed your jailer a sugar cube to keep him from a thing worth a kingdom," it said, "and he thanked you for it by punishing you, and went away certain he had won. In 1,000 years I have had keepers who hid me in vaults and keepers who hid me in kings' libraries, and not one of them was as safe as a boy who hides me behind a stolen heel of bread. You will keep me a long time, Harry Potter. You hide things the way the old craft hides things, in plain sight behind a better lie." He went to the library because of a word. The book used words he did not know, old words, work words, the silch and the G-res, but it had used one word, once, that was not a work word, in the grey morning after he'd held the ember starved for a full minute. "You have the makings of a true craftsman," it had said, the gold moving warm. "Merlin himself was slower at your age." And then the gold had gone still, the way it did when it had said more than it meant to, and the page had cleared, and Harry had been left holding a name he half knew from somewhere, a name out of the cartoons and the cheap picture books, a wizard with a beard and a pointed hat, and a certainty underneath it that the book had not meant the picture book wizard at all. The little winging public library was a low brick building between the chemist and the shut-down butcher's, and Harry was allowed to go there on Saturday mornings for the unimprovable reason that it got him out of the house and cost nothing. Aunt Petunia approved of the library the way she approved of anything that removed him without requiring her to look at him. He had been going for a year already, working through the children's shelves, and then, when those ran thin, the grown-up ones, reading far above his age because no one had ever told him not to and because the books did not care how small he was. The librarian was called Miss Pendle. She was old in the way of a thing that has been left out in the weather and grown harder rather than softer, all gray cardigan and reading glasses on a chain, and she had noticed Harry the way she noticed everything in her domain, and she had drawn from a year of Saturdays a set of conclusions about the undersized boy in the broken glasses that she had never once said aloud. She did not pity him. He would have felt pity and flinched from it. She did something rarer, which was to treat him as a reader, to hold books for him under the desk when she thought he would want them, to write his name on the request slips without comment when he asked for things far beyond the children's shelves, to say when he came in, "Morning, Mr. Potter," as though he were a person who came in and not a problem who had to be got rid of. He had no language for what that did to him, and so he did not examine it. He only knew that the low brick building was the one place outside his own dark country where the air did not press on him, and that the woman behind the desk was the one adult in his life who said his name as if it were a name and not a verdict. "I'm looking for Merlin," he told her that Saturday. "The real one, not the cartoon." Miss Pendle looked at him over the top of her glasses. "There isn't a real one strictly. He's legend, folklore." She was already coming round the desk, though, because a question was a question, and Miss Pendle did not waste a live question on a technicality. "But folklore's a kind of real, if you read it right. Come on." She took him to a shelf he had not reached yet, the long low one at the back where the building smelled most of dust and old glue, and she pulled down books, the Welsh Triads, the Historia of someone called Geoffrey, a fat grey volume of Arthurian sources with a cracked spine, and stacked them in his arms until he could barely see over them, talking the whole time in the low, even voice she used for books, telling him that Merlin had a dozen names and a dozen stories, and that the oldest of them. The Welsh ones, the Meaden ones, were stranger and colder than the tea-towel wizard, full of madness and prophecy, and a man who went into the woods and did not come out the same. "Why, Merlin?" she asked when she'd built his tower of books, not suspicious, curious, the clean curiosity of a person who is interested in what other people are interested in. Harry had his answer ready, because he always had his answer ready. "We did King Arthur at school," he said, which was a lie built true because they had last term in the form of a wall display he had helped color in. "I wanted to know the rest." She looked at him a moment longer, and he had the brief cold sense of being read by someone competent at it, and then she let it go because whatever she saw she had decided long ago was none of her business to name. "Well, there's a great deal of rest. Mind you bring them back in one piece." He read for 3 hours at the table by the window where the light was good, and he learned that the book in his cupboard had not been speaking idly. The Mueddin of the oldest stories was not a conjurer. He was a thing the world had produced for a purpose and then could not contain, a child of uncertain father, born already knowing things he should not know, who grew into a power that frightened kings and outlasted them. There was a line in the fat gray volume, quoted from somewhere older, that Harry read 4 times. He was set as a watch upon the land, and the watch did not end with his sleeping. He did not know what it meant. He knew with the cold certainty that had become his most reliable instrument that it meant something, and that the something was sitting behind the skirting in his cupboard, and that the closed door the book kept saying "not yet to" was somewhere on the far side of that line. There was another line in the back of the same volume, in a chapter the writer had clearly thought was the dull part, a copied fragment of a much older list, a roll of things the chroniclers called the hidden treasures, the workings and objects of the first craft that had been lost or hidden away against the day they would be needed again. Most of the list was names without things. But one entry stopped him, the Book of the Watch, which is blood-bound and answers to one hand in an age, and which was hidden when the line was hidden that it might find its own. He read it once and went very still at the table by the window, and did not read it a second time, because reading it a second time would have made it real in a way he was not, at that table, in that light, ready to let it be. He carried it out instead, whole, in the place where he carried everything, and decided he would take it out and look at it when he was somewhere the looking could not show on his face. He copied nothing down. He gave Miss Pendle back 2 of the books and kept the fat gray one under his jumper with her name on the slip and her eyes carefully elsewhere. And that was the thing about Miss Pendle, that her eyes were carefully elsewhere, that she had seen him take it and chosen not to see, because a boy who needed a book that badly was a boy she would let need it. He walked home through the bright ordinary streets of Little Winging thinking about a watch that did not end with its watchman sleeping, and a book that was hidden when the line was hidden that it might find its own, and feeling for the first time that the thing he had found in the attic might be larger than a clever way to make light in the dark, might in fact be the largest thing in his small life, and getting larger and pointed, the way everything in the old stories was pointed. At something that had not happened yet, that was the day, though he had no way to know it, that someone else began thinking about the same thing. Far to the north, in a city built of gray stone and rain, a man called Corvin Ash woke in the small hours with the taste of cold iron in his mouth and lay still in the dark, listening. He was not a young man, and not, in any way that mattered, an old one. He had been many things across a longer life than his face advertised, and the thing he was now had no clean name in the language the wand schools used, because the wand schools did not like to admit that the thing existed. He was a finder of lost workings. He went where the old magic had been buried and forgotten, and he dug it up, and he sold what could be sold and kept what could not, and the keeping had changed him over the years into something that could feel the old magic the way a shark feels a struggle in the water, a pressure, a direction, a hunger given a heading. And tonight, for the first time in longer than he cared to count, the water had moved. He rose and crossed to the window and stood looking south over the wet roofs, and he found the direction of it without trying, the way you find the source of a draught. South, a long way south, a small thing far off but a true thing, an old thing, a working of the first water waking after a sleep so long he had assumed, with everyone else who knew the old lore, that it was gone past finding. It pulsed, faint and regular, like a heartbeat heard through a wall. He had spent 30 years looking for the great lost workings and finding only their husks, the spent and the broken and the picked over. He had never felt one that was alive. "There you are," Corvin Ash said to the dark very softly, and the dark gave nothing back. "There you are." He did not move toward it yet. He was a patient man and a careful one, and a thing that had stayed hidden for 1,000 years would not be undone by haste in the first week of its waking. He marked the heading. He would feel it again, and each time he would refine the bearing until the small far pulse resolved into a place on a map, and the place into a street, and the street into a door. He had done it before with lesser prey. He had all the time the world allowed, and the thing in the south, whatever it was, did not know it had been heard. There were others who might hear it in time, the ministry with its dull instruments, the old families with their inherited noses for power, the school in the north with the long white beard at the head of its table. Ash thought about them with the contempt of a man who has spent his life beating institutions to the things they were too slow and too frightened to dig up themselves. They would feel it eventually, the great alive thing waking in the south, and they would convene and consider and form a committee. By the time their committee had agreed on a course of action, he intended to be holding the thing in his 2 hands. He went back to bed and lay with his eyes open and listened to it beat, the small, far heart of something old coming awake in the south of England, and he smiled in the dark, and the smile was the worst thing about him. 200 miles away, in a cupboard under a staircase in Surrey, Harry Potter held a circle the size of a dinner plate steady in the grey hour and felt, for a moment, an odd cold prickle at the back of his neck, the animal sense of being looked at. He held still. He widened the circle without meaning to, a flinch of the will, and then steadied it, and the prickle passed, and he told himself it was nothing, because he had no evidence that it was anything, and a boy who jumped at nothings would wear himself out before the somethings came. But he noted it. He noted everything. And behind the skirting, when he slid the book away that morning, the gold woke without his asking and wrote 2 words across the readied page, and then cleared them before he had finished reading, so that he was never quite sure afterward whether he had seen them at all. Be quick, the book had said. He did not know what it meant. He decided, walking out into another grey morning of bacon and contempt in the long, secret country underneath, that he would find out by being quick, and he went on, faster now, with a heading of his own. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Battle Magic. By the winter he was 7, Harry Potter could have hurt someone badly, and the only thing standing between the Dursleys and that fact was that he had decided, in the cold and the dark, that he would rather they never knew it. The strike came to him in February. He had felt it coming the way he now felt all the workings coming, a weight behind the readied page, and he had braced for it, because the book had refused him a thing in October for reaching, and he did not intend to be caught reaching again. So when the page filled with the word tarot and the shape of it poured into him, he received it the way he had taught himself to receive everything dangerous, which was without appetite, at arm's length, the way you take a knife by the handle that someone is holding out to you blade first. Tarot, the book said, a strike, the first of the workings that are made to be used against another, and so the first that can damn you. Light hides you, the wall keeps you, the fire you have learned to fear. This is none of those. This is a fist made of will and thrown across a room, and there is no innocent way to be caught having thrown it. Learn it where no one can see, use it only where no one can see, and understand before you cast it once that the world has no mercy for a child who can do this, only fear, and fear is the mother of every cage they would put you in. Show me, Harry said, and his voice did not shake because he had stopped letting it. The shape of the strike was simpler than the wall and uglier. The wall was a thing you held, the strike was a thing you released. You gathered the will the way you gathered it for the ember into a point, and then instead of holding the point starved you flung it, all at once, along a line your attention drew, and the world, eager as it always was to be given force, obeyed. He did not practice it in the cupboard or the shed or the bath, he practiced it in the woods. Past Magnolia Crescent the houses gave out into a strip of unloved woodland the council had never got round to building on, brambled and littered and ignored, and Harry had found over a year of Saturdays that no one went into it in winter. On the grey Saturday afternoons after the library, with the fat grey book read twice over and returned at last and 3 more borrowed in its place, he walked out past the last house and into the trees and trained where the only witnesses were crows. He chose a dead tree for it, a lightning-split birch already half down, leaning grey and barkless into the living wood, and he stood 10 feet from it in the wet leaf litter and gathered the strike and threw it. The first time almost nothing happened. A puff of bark, a patter of grey fragments, a small contemptuous talk like a thrown pebble. He had flinched at the moment of release, doubt rushing in at the worst instant, exactly as it had snuffed the first light a lifetime ago, and the strike had gone out of him weak and scattered. He noted it. He noted that the strike, like everything, lived or died on the cleanness of the will behind it, and that a strike thrown with doubt in it was worse than no strike at all, because it announced you without protecting you. He threw it again, clean. The dead birch jumped. There was a flat, hard crack, not loud but deep, a sound he felt in his sternum more than heard, and a section of the grey trunk the size of his head simply ceased to be where it had been, burst into splinters and punched inward, the whole leaning tree shuddering down its length and sloughing a year of dead branches onto the forest floor. A crow went up swearing. Harry stood in the sudden silence with his heart slow and his hand still half raised, and looked at the wound he had put in solid wood from 10 feet away with nothing but a clean thought, and he was for a moment afraid of himself, which the book had told him to be, and which he found he was, and which he decided to keep. Because the book had been right about the asymmetry. The wall had taken him months, the fire had taken him weeks. The strike took him an afternoon because the world wanted to give it, leaned toward giving it, the way a hill wants to give you a fall. Anyone could break a thing. The whole of the craft, he was beginning to understand, was not in the breaking. It was in the not breaking, in holding the strike caged behind his teeth on the days he most wanted to throw it, the way he held the embers starved. He trained the strike for a month of Saturdays, and he trained it the way he trained everything, by turning its variables until it had no secrets left. How far would it reach? Across the clearing, weakening with distance, useless past 30 feet. How fast could he throw, too? Not fast, the second came slow and thin, the channel needing a breath to clear, and he marked that as the most dangerous fact he knew about himself, that he had one good strike and then a gap, and that the gap was where a clever enemy would put a knife. How small could he make it? Could he throw a strike the size of a slap instead of a sledgehammer, a thing that would knock a boy down without breaking him open? That one took the longest. A strike held back to a fraction of itself was harder than a strike thrown whole. The way a man holding a heavy door half open strains more than a man who simply lets it slam, and he practiced the half-strike on saplings and on the surface of the brown winter pond until he could put exactly as much wool into it as the moment required, and not one thread more. That was the discipline the book cared about, and it said so once on a gray morning after a Saturday Harry had spent learning to throw a strike that would bruise and not break. "Now you're dangerous," it said, and the gold was neither warm nor cold but level, the voice of a thing taking a measurement. Any fool can be dangerous. You took a month to learn the strike, and you have taken 3 to learn how not to use all of it, and that is the only month that matters. The wand schools turn out 1,000 children a year who can break a tree. They turn out perhaps one in a generation who can stand in front of a thing he hates with the power to break it and choose the bruise. Be that one. The world has had enough of the other kind. Harry read it and thought of Uncle Vernon and of the strike caged behind his teeth and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the book did not already know he was thinking. There was an afternoon in that brick-cold February when he learned the true shape of the strike, and it was not in the woods, and it nearly ruined everything. Uncle Vernon had been drinking the bad kind of evening, not drunk. Vernon was never quite drunk, but soured 2 glasses past reason and looking for a place to put the sourness, and he found his place in the kitchen, where Harry was scrubbing a pan that had been cleaned before Vernon decided it was. The accusation did not matter. The accusations never mattered. They were only the door Vernon opened to get at the thing he actually wanted, which was the old animal pleasure of making something smaller than himself afraid. He had Harry by the back of the neck before the boy had set the pan down, the great hand closing on the small nape, bending him down toward the gray water, and he said something low and ugly about teaching him to do a job properly, and he pushed, and the strike rose in Harry unbidden. It came up out of the place behind his sternum where all the workings lived, faster than thought, the clean ugly fist of wool gathering itself without his asking, pointed, and for one suspended instant Harry Potter stood bent over a sink with his uncle's hand on his neck and held behind his teeth, a working that he knew with absolute cold certainty would put Vernon Dursley through the kitchen wall. He could feel exactly how much of it the moment wanted, all of it, the whole sledgehammer. He could feel how easy it would be, easier than the wall, easier than the ember, the world leaning toward it the way a hill leans toward a fall, and he could feel underneath the ease the small dark pleasure of the thought, the pleasure of imagining the great pink terror of his uncle's face in the half-second before the strike took him, and that pleasure was the most frightening thing in the kitchen, more frightening than the hand on his neck because it was his. He held it. He held it the way he had spent 3 months of Saturdays learning to hold the half-strike on saplings, not by being unable to throw it, which would have been weakness, but by being able to throw it and choosing, in the teeth of every reason to, not to. He held the whole sledgehammer caged behind his teeth while his uncle bent his face toward the dirty water, and he let the moment be only what it was, a large soured man and a small cold boy in a pan, and he said in the flat bored voice that gave Vernon nothing to push against, "It's clean now. Look." And Vernon, robbed of the resistance that fed him, looked at the pan and found it clean and was cheated of his evening, and let go with a final contemptuous shove and went to find a less disappointing victim in the television. Harry finished the washing up with hands that did not shake and went to his cupboard and sat in the dark and was afraid, deliberately on purpose, the way the book had taught him to be afraid of the right things, of how close it had come, and of how good it had felt to be close. He told the book that night because he told the book everything now, and because this was the kind of thing that festered if it was carried alone, and the book was the only thing in the world he could set it down in front of. "I almost threw it," he said, "at Uncle Vernon, not the half-strike, all of it, and the worst part wasn't that I almost did it, the worst part was that I wanted to." Gold woke slow, and what it wrote was not comfort and was not blame and was the truest thing anyone had ever said to him. "Of course you wanted to," the book said. "He has hurt you your whole life, and you have grown strong enough to hurt him back, and the wanting is not a flaw in you, child. It is the most natural thing in the world. Every keeper down the long line has stood where you stood tonight, with the power in their hand and a face in front of them they had every reason to break and wanted it. Ones who tell you they never wanted it are lying, and a watchman who lies to himself about what is in him is a watchman who will be surprised by it one day at the worst possible moment with the worst possible thing in his hand. You did not fail tonight. You succeeded at the only thing that has ever mattered. You wanted to throw the strike, and you knew you wanted to, and you held it anyway. That is not the absence of the dark thing. That is mastery of it. The killer is not the one who feels the wanting. The killer is the one who has stopped holding it. You held it. Hold it again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day a face you hate stands in front of a hand that could break it for the rest of your life, and on the day you stop having to hold it, the day the wanting is simply gone, you will know you have become something better than the man who put his hand on your neck. Not because you cannot hurt him, because you no longer need to. Harry sat with that a long time in the dark, the strike quiet now behind his teeth, the wanting ebbed but not gone, and he understood that the book had just handed him the hardest discipline of all the disciplines it had taught him, harder than the wall, harder than the starved ember, harder than the half-strike on the saplings. The hardest thing was not learning to break the world. The world wanted to be broken. It took an afternoon. The hardest thing was standing every day inside reach of the people who had earned the breaking, with the whole of the power to give it to them, and choosing again and again in the cold and the dark and the soured kitchen evenings to be the keeper and not the killer, and to do it not because he was too weak to do otherwise, but because he was strong enough to choose and had chosen. He chose it the next day and the day after. He was choosing it still. The binding came next, and it was the first working he genuinely loved, because it was the first that was made not to break a thing but to stop it. Whim, the page said, a binding. The shape of it was the opposite of the strike, not a fist flung out but a net thrown over, a wrapping of wool around a moving thing to make it still. Where the strike wanted doubt to ruin it, the binding wanted patience. You did not fling the whim, you settled it, draped it, closed it, and the thing inside it slowed and stopped and stood held, the way the air had stood held inside the wall, except that now it was not air he was insisting on but the limbs of a living thing. He practiced it on the crows and felt bad about it, and did it anyway, because the only moving things in the winter wood were the crows and himself, and he could not very well bind himself. He learned to settle the whim over a crow on a branch and feel it go rigid and furious in the net of his will, wings half spread and frozen, beak open on a soundless scream, and he learned to hold it exactly as long as he meant and then to let it go cleanly, so that it burst off the branch unhurt and swearing, and he was careful, he was always careful now, never to hold one so long that it panicked itself to death. Because a working that left a ring of dead crows under one tree was a working that drew the wrong eyes, and because though he did not examine the thought, he knew what it was to be held by something larger than yourself and screaming with no sound coming out, and he did not want to be the thing that did that, not even to a crow, not for longer than the learning took. The book approved of the binding. Yes, it said, this is the truer power, any beast can strike. To bind, to take a thing's force and hold it and give it back unspent, that is the work of a keeper and not a killer. Remember which you are. There will be days you forget. On those days, remember harder. He was getting better at remembering. He was also that winter getting careless in a way he did not see, because the carelessness was not in the workings he guarded like a miser, but in himself, in the boy who walked back from the woods on a Saturday afternoon with a month of broken birches behind him and a new straightness in his spine that he did not know he was wearing. Aunt Petunia saw it first. She had always watched him. Watching was the thing Aunt Petunia did instead of feeling, a long-necked, sidelong, ceaseless surveillance that took in everything and forgave none of it. And what she had been watching for 7 years was a small, frightened thing that flinched when she raised her voice and went where it was put and made itself as little as it could. That thing had been the proof that the world was arranged correctly, and somewhere in the winter it had stopped being there, and she had noticed its absence the way you notice a clock that has stopped, not at once, but in an accumulating wrongness of the silence. The boy did not flinch any more. That was what she could not stop seeing. She would round on him in the kitchen with her voice up and her hand half raised, and he would simply look at her, level, unhurried, his eyes steady behind the broken glasses, and wait for it to be over, the way you wait for weather, and the not flinching frightened her more than any defiance could have, because defiance she understood and would have known how to crush. This was not defiance. The boy was not fighting her. He had simply somewhere stopped being afraid, and a thing that has stopped being afraid of you is a thing you have lost your hold on, and Petunia Dursley had spent her whole adult life making certain she would never again be in a room with something she had no hold on. She knew what it meant. That was the part she could not say to Vernon, could not say to anyone, could barely say to herself in the dark when the house was asleep and the old draught came under the doors. She had grown up beside a girl who had stopped being afraid in exactly this way, a girl who had gone quiet and strange and certain one summer and never gone back, a girl the letters had come for, a girl who had ended in a green flash and a ruin in the West Country and a basket on a doorstep. Petunia knew the look of a child who has found a door the rest of the world cannot see. She had hated that look for 30 years. And now it was in her kitchen, in her sister's son, in the small cold eyes that did not flinch, and she did the only thing she had ever known how to do with it, which was to press down harder and feed it less and pray, in the wordless way of a woman who did not believe in prayer, that if she made the boy small enough the door would close again on its own. It would not close, she knew that too. But knowing a thing and being able to bear it were different countries, and Petunia Dursley had been living in the gap between them since the day the basket appeared, and she went on living there and watched her nephew stop being afraid and said nothing and was more frightened than she had been in 30 years. Harry saw all of it. He had been reading that kitchen since before he could read words. He saw the half-raised hand that did not fall, the eyes that slid off him and came back, the new thing in his aunt that was not quite hatred and not quite fear but built of both, and he understood it faster than she did because he had information she did not. He knew exactly what he was, and so when he watched her circle the knowledge of it without ever landing, he was watching her arrive slowly and against her will at a truth he already held. He thought about it that night behind the skirting with the book warm against the wall. She knows, he said quietly into the dark, not what, but that there's a what. She's known something like it before. The gold woke. Yes, the book said. Your mother's sister has seen the craft walk in a child once already, and it broke something in her that never set straight. She will not tell. Telling would mean saying aloud the thing she has spent her life refusing to have in her house. She will press and starve and watch and hope you stop. You will not stop, so the danger from her is not that she will expose you. It is that she will be right about you before you are ready to be found out, and that her certainty will leak in a word to her husband, a glance held too long in front of the wrong neighbor, a fear that fills a house until someone cleverer than she is smells it. Guard against that. A secret is not kept by you alone. It is kept by everyone who half suspects it and chooses, for their own reasons, to look away. The day one of them stops choosing, you are found. Harry lay in the dark and turned that over because it was a larger and colder idea than he had been carrying, that his secret did not live in his own discipline alone, that it lived also in Aunt Petunia's refusal, and Dudley's stupidity, and Miss Pendle's averted eyes, and a whole quiet architecture of other people declining to see him, and that the architecture could fall from any direction at any time, for reasons that had nothing to do with how well he held a wall. Then I need them to keep looking away, he said, all of them, on purpose. I need to be so far beneath looking at that looking away isn't even a choice they make. Now, said the book, and the gold moved with something close to pride, you are thinking like the thing you are. Smallness is a wall too. Wear it. It will keep you longer than any silch. He wore it. Through the rest of that winter he wore his smallness like armor, flinched on purpose when flinching cost him nothing, took the contempt in the cupboard and the thin meals and let them land, and underneath the worn thin boy the other one grew straighter and colder and more capable by the week, hidden inside the disguise of exactly the child the Dursleys needed him to be. It was the most disciplined thing he had ever done, harder than the wall, harder than the starved ember, because the wall and the ember only asked him to control the world, and this asked him to control himself in front of people he had every reason to want to frighten, and to go on choosing the bruise over the break 100 times a day, in 1,000 small surrenders, none of which anyone would ever thank him for. He thought he could keep it up forever. He was wrong, and the thing that proved him wrong was not Aunt Petunia, who watched, or Uncle Vernon, who suspected nothing because suspicion required imagination, but Dudley, who needed nothing from Harry at all except the oldest thing one boy can want from another, which was the pleasure of watching him hurt. They called it Harry hunting, and they had been playing it for 2 years. The rules were simple, and Dudley had made them. There were 5 of them, Dudley and Piers Polkiss with his rat's face, and the 3 larger and stupider boys who orbited Dudley, because orbiting Dudley meant a share of whatever Dudley took, and the game was to catch Harry alone, away from any adult who might inconveniently be made to care, and to hurt him in whatever way the afternoon suggested. He had been faster than them for a year, and that had been enough, because they were lazy and he was quick, and a quick thing that runs is usually more trouble than a fat boy wants to chase. But it had been a wet, penned-up, boring spring, and boredom made Dudley industrious, and on a gray Thursday after school they did the one thing Harry had not planned for, which was to be patient and clever, and to catch him where the running stopped. It was the alley behind the row of garages off Wisteria Walk, a brick throat with one end and no other, and Harry walked into it because the short way home went through it, and because he had grown, he saw now, complacent, had let the worn-thin disguise convince even himself that he was too far beneath notice to be hunted. He was 10 steps in when Piers stepped out of the garage gap ahead of him, grinning, and he turned, and the other 4 were filling the mouth of the alley behind, Dudley in the middle of them, breathing through his mouth, pleased. Nowhere to run, Dudley said, and the 3 big boys laughed because Dudley had said a thing, and Piers giggled his rat's giggle, and they came down the brick throat toward him, unhurried, the way you walk toward a thing that cannot get away. Harry stood very still and did the arithmetic, because arithmetic was what he did when the world narrowed, and the world had narrowed to a brick corridor with 5 boys in it and one of him. He could run at the front and try to bull past Piers, who was small. He would not make it. Piers would grab, and the others would be on him in the 2 seconds the grab bought. He could take the beating, which was the thing he had always done, the bruise over the break, the disguise held even here, and a part of him, the disciplined part, the part that had worn smallness like armor all winter, said take it. It is only pain, pain heals, exposure does not. And he listened to that part and he had nearly obeyed it when the largest of the three big boys, a slab-faced child called Malcolm, reached him first and took a fistful of his hair and his collar together and slammed him back into the brick wall hard enough that the world went white and his glasses jumped off his face and skittered across the wet concrete. And somewhere in the white he heard Dudley say lazily, "Mind his head, my mum'll see," and heard the others laugh. And felt Malcolm draw back the other fist. And the disciplined part of him, the part that counseled patience, went quiet, and a different part spoke, and the different part was very cold and very clear and did not raise its voice. No, he did not throw the strike. Even then, blind and ringing against the brick, he did not throw the strike, because the strike broke things, and a boy with a punched-in chest was a body, and a body was the end of every secret he had. He threw the half-strike, the bruise, not the break, the working he had spent 3 months of Saturdays learning to hold back to a fraction of itself, and he threw it not as a fist, but as a wall thrown outward, a flat, hard shove of will that took all 5 of them at once across the narrow throat of the alley. The air cracked. Malcolm left the ground. So did the others. 5 boys lifted off their feet and flung back as though a lorry had passed through the alley sideways, and they went down in a tangle of limbs and surprise 8 feet from where they'd stood, and into the half-second of their falling Harry did the second thing, the thing he had decided on in the white instant against the brick, which was to make sure that whatever they told anyone afterward, they would never be believed. He called the light not a bead this time, but a flood. Every scrap of will he had, lumen opened all the way, and he put it not in front of him, but behind his own eyes shut tight, and flung it out at the 5 sprawling boys at point-blank range. The alley went white. Not lit, annihilated, a soundless, blinding flare that filled the brick throat wall to wall and ceiling to ground. A light with no source any of them would be able to point to because it had come from everywhere at once, and through the blaze of it, with his own eyes screwed shut and his hands over them, Harry heard them scream. It was not pain that made them scream. He had been careful, he was always careful, and the half-strike had bruised and winded and frightened them and broken nothing, and the light did not burn. What made them scream was that the world had stopped making sense. One instant they had been 5 boys beating a smaller boy in an alley, the oldest and safest game there was, and the next instant an invisible lorry had thrown them down and the sky had turned to white fire and there was no cause for any of it, no thrown punch, no explosion, no thing they could name, only the small hated cousin standing untouched in the middle of it with his eyes shut and his hands over his face. And the human animal, when the world stops making sense, does not reason. It runs. They ran. Light still bleeding out of the air, blind and weeping and falling over each other, they clawed their way to the mouth of the alley and out and away. And Dudley ran with them, Dudley who had never run from anything in his life, Dudley screaming for his mother in a voice that had gone back 5 years, and Harry stood alone in the dying glare and listened to the 5 sets of footsteps panic away down Wisteria Walk and let the light go out. The alley was a brick alley again. Gray, wet, ordinary, empty. His glasses lay 6 feet away, with one lens cracked clean across. His scalp was bleeding where Malcolm had pulled his hair, and the back of his head was a dull roar of pain where it had met the wall. And he stood in the quiet and took inventory of himself the way he took inventory of a working that had just run, and found that his hands were steady, and that he was not afraid, and that the not being afraid was the most dangerous thing in the alley, more dangerous than the strike. Because a boy who is not afraid after doing what he had just done is a boy who could come to do it easily, and he marked that, and was afraid of that deliberately on purpose, because the book had taught him that the fear you choose is the only thing that keeps you from the thing you should fear. Then he cleaned up. He had perhaps 10 minutes before the 5 of them reached an adult, and he used them. He picked up his glasses and looked at the cracked lens and decided that the crack was useful, that a beaten boy ought to have a cracked lens, and put them on. He pressed his sleeve to his bleeding scalp until it slowed, because a bleeding boy who walked in calm was a story, and a bleeding boy who walked in frightened was no story at all. He looked at the alley and saw nothing to claim, no scorch, no mark, no broken thing, because he had broken nothing, which was the whole of why he had spent 3 months learning not to, and he understood, standing there, that the discipline of the bruise over the break had just saved his life in a way he had not foreseen when he learned it. There was no evidence, because he had made certain, months ago in a winter wood, that there would never be any evidence. The restraint was not a kindness, it was the cover. The book had told him so, and he had believed it as a principle, and now he knew it in his body, which was a different and a deeper kind of knowing. He walked home slowly, a small beaten boy with a cracked lens and a bloodied head, and he arranged his face into exactly the face the afternoon required, and he was 3 streets from home when the disciplined part and the cold part finished their conference inside him and agreed on the lesson, which was not I am powerful, he had known that, but I was seen. 5 people had seen the impossible happen around him. It did not matter that they could not explain it, that they would not be believed, that no adult on earth would credit a tale of invisible lorries and skies turning white in an alley with no cause. They had seen him at the center of it, untouched, eyes shut, and children do not forget the center of the thing that frightened them. And Dudley most of all would carry the memory home, and it would sit in him and curdle, and Aunt Petunia, who already half knew, would hear her son's impossible story, and the half-knowing would become three-quarters, and the quiet architecture of people declining to see him would take its first real crack. He had defended himself, and the defending had cost him the one thing the disguise was built to protect, which was the certainty in everyone who looked at him that there was nothing there to see. He needed to never be seen again, not the workings himself at the center of them. He needed to be able to do what he had done in the alley and have no one able to say afterward that he had been there at all. He told the book that night, the back of his head throbbing against the cool wall, and the gold woke slow, and what it wrote was not praise and not blame, but the next working readied early because he had earned it the hard way. Carol, the book said, concealment, the unseen. I had meant to keep it from you another year, but you have shown me today that you will need it before you are ready for it, and a working you need and lack is worse than a working you have before your time. Learn it. It is the hardest of all the ones you know, harder than the wall, because the wall hides a thing inside it, and this hides the thing that is doing the hiding. Done well, you may stand in the middle of a crowded room and do murder, and no eye will hold you, no memory will keep you, the seeing will slide off you like water off old cloth. Done badly, it does nothing, and you will not know what you have done until it is too late to matter. You will be a long time learning it. Begin tonight. You no longer have the luxury of beginning tomorrow. He began that night. He lay in the cupboard with a cracked lens and a bleeding scalp and reached for the shape of Carol, and it was every bit as hard as the book had promised, a working that asked him not to do a thing but to subtract himself, to make the fact of his own presence into a thing the world overlooked, and he got nowhere with it for hours, and was not discouraged because the book did not lie, and the book had said he would be a long time. And a thing you have been warned is hard is a thing you do not give up on the first night, but he understood, lying there, that something had changed that was larger than a new working. He had crossed a line in the brick alley. For 7 years he had been a thing the world did to. This afternoon, for the first time, he had been a thing that did back, had stood in a corner with 5 enemies closing and chosen, coldly, deliberately, exactly how much of his power to spend and spent it and walked away whole while they ran weeping. He was not a victim anymore. The Dursleys did not know it yet. Dudley, sobbing in his mother's arms 3 rooms away, half knew it. Aunt Petunia, holding her son and listening to his impossible story with her long neck rigid and her face the color of ash, knew it almost completely. And Harry in the cupboard, reaching for the working that would let him do it all again and leave no trace, knew it entirely and lay still with the knowledge, and was careful, even now, even here, to be afraid of it. What he could not know was that he had not only been seen by 5 frightened children that afternoon. Far to the north, the man called Corvin Ash had been bent over a map of southern England for 3 weeks, refining a bearing, and at the moment the alley turned white, at the moment a 7-year-old opened the working called Lumen all the way, and flung it wall to wall in a fit of cold survival. The small, far heart Ash had been tracking did not pulse. It flared. For one instant, on the map under his hands, the dim and patient signal he had been triangulating for a month roared up into something he could have found with his eyes closed from the other end of the country. A spike of the old craft used in anger, raw and bright and unmistakable, and then it was gone, dropped back down to the faint sleeping beat, hidden again, careful again. But it had been a month of careful. This had been a single instant of careless, and a single instant was all a patient man needed. Corvin Ash stood up from the map. He set his finger on the place the flare had come from, a smudge of suburb south of London, a name that meant nothing and would soon mean everything, and he smiled the smile that was the worst thing about him. Surrey, he said to the empty room. You're in Surrey, and you're not asleep at all, are you? You're a child. A child who's just been frightened into using something he should not have. He began that night to pack. 200 miles south, in a cupboard under the stairs, Harry Potter failed at concealment for the 100th time and the 91st and tried again, while 3 rooms away his aunt sat awake in the dark with her son finally asleep and her own old terror wide awake, and could not have said which of them, the watcher or the watched, was the more afraid. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. Merlin's legacy concealment took him 11 weeks, and he knew the exact morning he had it, because it was the morning Aunt Petunia looked straight at him and could not find him. He had failed at Carol every night since the alley. The book had warned him he would, and the warning had been the only thing that kept him at it, because there was no progress he could measure, no duration to log, no birch to break, only the nightly attempt to subtract himself from the world's attention, and the nightly silence that told him nothing about whether he had moved a single inch toward the thing. The wall he could feel, the strike he could see land. Concealment gave him no feedback at all, because the only proof that it worked was the absence of an event, the eye that did not turn, the memory that did not form, and you cannot watch an absence. You can only walk out into the world and stake your safety on it and find out. He found a way to measure it anyway, because he always found a way. He could not test the working on a person without risking everything if it failed, so he tested it first on the thing in the house most like a person in its attention and least able to report him. The cat. Mrs. Fig 2 doors down kept cats the way other people kept dust, and one of them, a vast yellow-eyed Tom called Tibbles, had taken to sitting on the Dursleys' fence and watching the garden with the flat, unblinking interest cats reserve for things they have not yet decided whether to kill. A cat's eye was honest. A cat would track a sparrow's hop across a lawn from 40 feet, would lock onto the smallest moving thing and hold it, and so Harry stood in the garden in the long spring evenings, supposedly weeding and worked Carol, and watched the yellow eyes to see whether they would lose him. For 10 weeks the eyes held him. He would feel for the subtraction, reach for the place where his own presence stopped being a thing the world noticed, and Tibbles would go on staring at him with bored contempt, unfooled, and Harry would know he had failed again without having to risk a single human witness to learn it. On the 11th week, the eyes slid off. He had reached for the working the way he had 1,000 times, and this time something turned over in him that had never turned before. A quiet click he felt behind his sternum where all the workings were paid for, and the yellow eyes that had been fixed on him for 10 weeks went loose, unfocused, and drifted past him to the fence and the sparrows in the middle distance, searching, mildly puzzled, for the boy who had been weeding the bed a moment ago and was somehow no longer worth looking at. Tibbles yawned. Tibbles began with enormous dignity to wash, and Harry stood 4 feet away in plain sight in the last of the evening light and was not seen, and held the working with his heart going slow and even and a cold clean joy rising in him that he let himself feel exactly once before he set it down and made sure of it. Because once was not proof. A cat was not a person. He spent the rest of that week making sure, raising the stakes by inches the way he raised every stake, held Carol while Dudley walked past him in the hall and watched his cousin's eyes pass over him like a window, held it at the dinner table, briefly, terrifyingly, and watched Uncle Vernon ask Aunt Petunia to pass the salt over the top of a nephew who had, for 4 held seconds, stopped being in the room. And on the last day of that week, the morning he was certain, he held it in the kitchen while Aunt Petunia came in to start the breakfast, and she stopped in the doorway with the long neck and the watching eyes that had hunted him for 7 years, and she looked at the place where he stood, and her gaze swept the kitchen once, twice, found the kettle and the bread and the window and the back door, and did not find him, not once, though he stood against the counter close enough to touch her. And after a moment she frowned at the empty kitchen and the faint sense of a thing forgotten and went to fill the kettle, and Harry let the working go and was simply there again, and she startled half out of her skin to find the boy standing where she would have sworn the kitchen had been empty. "Don't creep," she snapped with a violence that came from the place the old terror lived, and he murmured an apology and was small and worn and beneath notice, and underneath it the cold boy noted that he had just stood unseen in front of the most watchful pair of eyes in his world, and that the last wall was built, and that there was now, for the first time, almost nothing the Dursleys could do to him that he could not simply step out of the way of. He told the book that night, and he expected praise, because Carol had been the hardest thing he had ever done, and the book had said as much. The book did not give him praise. The gold woke slow and grave, graver than he had ever seen it, and what it wrote stopped the breath in him. "You have finished the lesser craft." He read it twice. "There's more," he said. It was not a question. He had always known there was more. The book had been telling him not yet for a year, and a not yet is only ever a yes with a date on it. "There is more," the book agreed, "and you are at last large enough to be told the first of it. Sit, do not reach. What I am about to give you is not a working. It is the truth of why I exist and why you do, and a boy who reaches for that truth before he can hold it will be crushed by it the way a cupped hand is crushed by the sea. You have spent a year learning to hold things. Tonight you will learn whether you can hold the largest thing there is. Set the book on the floor before you, put both your hands flat upon it, and open your blood to me, not a drop this time. Your whole hand, press and do not flinch, and I will show you what you are." Harry sat very still in the dark of the cupboard. He had learned to be afraid of the right things, and a part of him, the disciplined part, the careful part, the part that had kept him alive, said, "This is too far, this is a door you cannot unopen, you do not know what is on the other side." And the other part, the part that had stood in a brick alley and chosen exactly how much of itself to spend, said the thing it had said in the attic at the very beginning, the thing that had never once been wrong: "It is yours. It has always been yours. You have only been growing toward it. Open the door." He set the book on the cupboard floor. He laid both hands flat upon the dark hide that had been warm against his skin for a year and had never once lied to him. He thought of his mother and father, the hands that had loved him, who had set this here for exactly this night. And he pressed and the rough old binding bit into his palms, and he did not flinch, and his blood, his whole hand's worth, welling up from 100 small pressures, sank into the book the way the first drop had sunk a year ago, all at once, and the cupboard and the house and the world came apart in light. He was not in the cupboard. He stood on a hill that did not exist, under a sky he had no name for, and the sky was the inside of the book. He understood that much at once, that he had not gone anywhere, that the book had simply opened wide enough to stand inside, the way a single drop of his blood had once opened it wide enough to read. The hill was bare turf and gray stone. The sky above it was not night and not day, but the deep blue-black of the hour the cupboard belonged to, the hour with no eyes in it, and it was full of stars that were also words, the rutan spur script burning cold and silver from one horizon to the other, a whole firmament of writing too vast and too old to read, turning slowly overhead like a wheel. And there was a voice in it, and the voice was the book's voice and was the gold on the page voice grown to fill a sky, and when it spoke the stars that were words flared in time with it, so that he did not so much hear the voice as stand inside the saying of it. Look, it said, and do not be afraid, fear is for the lesser craft, there is no room in you for it here. He looked, and the hill showed him the line. It came up out of the turf at his feet, a thread of silver light, and it ran away from him down the long slope of the hill and into the dark and did not end. A line of fire laid through the grass, and standing along it, at intervals he could not measure, were figures. They were made of the same cold silver as the line that joined them, and they faced away from him down the slope into the past, a procession of men and women receding into a distance that was also a depth, each one standing where the line passed through them, each one a keeper, and Harry understood without being told that he was looking at everyone who had ever held the book, every hand the watch had passed through, all the way back down the hill to the first of them, who stood at the very bottom where the line came out of the dark, taller than the rest and older than the rest, his back to all of them, looking out at something Harry could not see. Meodin, said the sky. Merlin, you would say. Emrys, the Romans wrote him, and Ambrosius, and 100 names and 100 mouths, because a thing the world cannot hold it tries to hold by naming, and fails and names again. He was the first. He is the one at the foot of the hill, and he is looking, as he has looked for 1500 years, at the thing he was set to watch. What thing? Harry said, and his voice on the unreal hill was steady, because the book had told him there was no room in him for fear here, and the book did not lie. The sky was quiet a moment, and the cold silver stars turned, and when it answered the way the truest things are answered, which is slowly and from a great way off. There are powers older than the craft, it said, older than the wand and the school and the ministry and Merlin himself, older than men, older than speech, things that were turned out of the world when the world was made and have been pressing back against the edges of it ever since, patient as the sea against a wall. The wand wizards do not know they exist. They have grown comfortable in their little age of marks out of 10, and they have forgotten that their comfort is a thing somebody is holding shut for them, a door somebody is leaning against in the dark while they sleep. Merlin knew. Merlin was made to know, born of no clean father, born already knowing, a child the world produced precisely because the world needed a watchman, and watchmen are not born into peace. He found the thinnest place in the wall, the place where the old dark pressed hardest, and he set himself there, and he held the door, and when his body failed him he did not die so much as thin went into the hill, the stories say, into the stone, into a sleep that is not sleep, and he laid the watch down not into the ground but into me, into the book, into the blood. So that the door would go on being held by his line, hand to hand, down the long hill in every age, whether the age remembered it or not. The line of figures burned silver in the turning dark, hand to hand, age to age, and Harry looked down the slope of them to the tall one at the bottom with his back to all his children, holding a door against the sea, and then he looked at his own feet where the line came up out of the grass, and he understood, before the sky said it, what he was standing at the top of. You are the last of them, the sky said. The line ran thin. The wand world forgot it had a watch, and a forgotten thing is an unguarded thing, and the keepers grew few, and the few grew careless, and there came an age, your mother's and father's age, when the door was held by hands that did not know what they were holding, who had me as an heirloom and a mystery and never once woke me, because the waking is in the blood, and their blood was not the blood that opens me. They knew only that the book was old and theirs and not to be lost, and that it must go to their son. They were right without knowing why they were right. They set me in the dark to wait for the hand that the watch had been seeking for 3 generations, for the blood come round again, true and whole, the air the line had been thinning toward all along. They set me in an attic, and they died. They died because of this, Harry said. It was the first thing on the unreal hill that touched the disciplined, careful part of him, the part that did arithmetic, and the arithmetic it did was very cold. The green flash, the ruin in the west country, it wasn't a car crash, it was the door. Something came for the watch and it killed them. The sky did not answer at once, and the silence was itself an answer, and when the voice came again it was gentler than he had ever heard it, gentle the way a hand is gentle on a wound it cannot heal. Not the old dark, it said, not the thing at the foot of the hill, that pressure is patient and slow and does not strike in a night. What killed your mother and father was nearer and smaller and more human, a wand wizard who had made himself terrible, who hunted your family for a reason of his own that touched the watch only by accident, and who has gone, for now, into a dark of his own. I do not grieve as you grieve, and I will not pretend to. But I will tell you this because it is true, and because you are large enough tonight to hold a true thing. They did not die for nothing, and they did not die for the watch, and the watch is not a debt their death has handed you. It is older than their death. It would have come to you if they had lived to be 100. You did not inherit a tragedy. You inherited a post, a post. Harry stood on the hill at the top of the long silver line and held the word the way he had learned to hold the ember, exactly, without letting it grow into the things it wanted to grow into, grief or rage, or the vast cold vertigo of a 6-year-old who has just been shown that he is the last sentinel of a wall older than mankind. He held it at exactly its own size, a post, a thing to be kept. He had spent a year learning to keep things, to keep a wall, to keep a secret, to keep himself. And now the sky was telling him that the keeping had never been the point but only the training, that everything he had taught himself in the gray hours had been the blunt edge of a single instrument the world had been forging out of a forgotten boy in a cupboard, and the instrument was a watchman, and the watch was the door, and the door was real, and the thing behind it was real, and it was, very slowly, very patiently pressing, he let himself feel it once. The whole weight of it, the line and the door and the dark and the dead parents who had set a book in an attic for a son they would not live to teach, he let it land on him all at once, the way he had let the warmth and smallness land all winter, and it was heavier than anything he had ever held, and he held it, and he did not break, and then he set it down, because a thing felt twice becomes a thing you carry, and he could not afford to carry this. He could only afford to be it. Why me, he said, not a complaint, a question, the kind he took to the library, the kind that wanted an answer and not a comfort. Out of everyone, why does it come round to a boy in a cupboard? Because the watch does not choose the comfortable, the sky said, it never has. Look at the foot of the hill. Merlin was a fatherless thing kings were afraid of. The keepers down the long slope were exiles and madmen and hunted men and women who frightened the people around them. Every one, because the watch is not given to those the world is kind to. The world is kind to people it has a use for, and a watchman is of no use to anyone until the night the door fails. And so the watch goes, age on age, to the ones the world has already thrown away, to the orphan, to the freak, to the boy in the cupboard who has had to learn, with no one's help in the dark, exactly the disciplines a watchman needs. You were not chosen because you were loved. You were chosen because you were left alone long enough to become hard enough to hold the door, and because your blood is the blood, come round at last. The cupboard did not happen to you despite the watch. I will not tell you it happened because of the watch. The world is crueler and stupider than that, and your aunt is only a frightened woman and not an instrument of fate. But the cupboard made you, and the watch needed what the cupboard made, and here you are at the top of the hill, the last of the line, 7 years old, and the strongest of all of them since Merlin himself, because you have had to be. The line of silver figures burned down the slope into the dark, and the sky full of word stars turned, and at the foot of the hill the first and oldest keeper stood with his back to all of them, holding his door, and as Harry watched, the tall silver figure did a thing none of the others did. It turned its head, just slightly, just enough. As though 1,500 years down the slope at the very bottom of the hill, the watchman had felt the new hand take up the line at the top, and had turned for one instant to look back up the long procession of his blood at the last of them, the small one, the one in the cupboard, and though the figure had no face Harry could read, he felt the look land on him across 15 centuries, and it was not a command, and it was not a blessing. It was recognition, one watchman seeing another, you. At last, good, and then the figure turned its face back to the door because a watchman does not look away from the door for long, and the moment closed, and the hill began to fade. Wake now, said the sky, growing small, drawing back down into gold on a page. You have held the largest thing there is, and you did not break, and so you have earned the first of the deep workings, the craft that is Merlin's own and not the lesser stuff of trees and bullies, but not tonight. Tonight you will sleep and let the truth settle into you the way a foundation settles, slowly, taking the weight. And tomorrow, when you are sure the hill did not crack you, you will come back and I will begin to teach you the watchcraft, and you will learn what the lesser craft was only the doorway to. Sleep, air of the line, the door holds, it is always held, it will hold one more night without you. The hill was gone, the sky was gone. The cold silver firmament of words drew down and down into a single page in the dark, and Harry Potter knelt on the floor of a cupboard under a staircase in Surrey with his hands pressed flat to a closed book, and his palms scored and aching, and his blood gone back into the dark hide without a mark, and he was 7 years old, and he was the last watchman of a door older than his species, and the house around him slept on, oblivious. The great oblivious house that had made him exactly hard enough to bear it. He took his hands off the book. He sat back on his heels in the dark, and for a long time he did not move, and did not light a light, and did not reach for a working, and only knelt there with the weight settling into him, taking the load, the way the sky had said it would. Then he lay down and curled his scored hands under his chin and slept and did not dream, because the thing that would have been a dream had already happened and was true. He waited 3 days before he went back to the book, and the waiting was its own discipline. A lesser boy or a hungrier one would have pressed his hands to the hide the next gray morning, greedy for the watchcraft, drunk on the size of what he'd been shown. Harry did not. He had been told a thing too large to use carelessly, and he treated the telling the way he treated every dangerous gift, at arm's length until he was sure of his grip. He spent 3 days being ordinary. He weeded and minded the bacon and took his contempt and held the worn thin smallness over the watchman like a coat over armor, and he watched himself privately for cracks, for any sign that the hill had broken something in him, that the weight had got in where it could rot. It hadn't. On the third night he knew it hadn't, because the ordinary days had held, because a boy who had been cracked by the truth could not have weeded a flower bed with his mind that quiet. He was sound. He had taken the foundation's weight. He went back to the book. Now it said, and the gold was steady, the grand voice of the hill folded back down into a teacher in the dark. The first of the deep workings, not a strike, not a wall, those were the alphabet. This is the first word. It is called in the old tongue the sight, and it is Merlin's own, the gift he was born with, and the rest of the line had to be given. Most who carry the watchcraft never master it. You will, because you have spent your whole life doing nothing else. What does it do? Harry said. It lets you see what is there. The gold moved slow. You think you already do, you do not. The world the wand wizards walk through is a world of paint and glamour, of things wearing faces that are not their own, a hidden man who slides off the eye, a lie dressed as a friend, an old dark thing pressing through a thin place while the surface of the air pretends to be empty. The sight strips the paint. With it you look at a glamoured man and see the man, you look at a quiet room and see the working hidden in its corner, you look at the thinnest place in the world and see what lends against it. It is the watchman's eye. A watchman who cannot see through a disguise is no watchman at all. He is a guard dog barking at the postman while the thief comes over the back wall wearing the postman's face. Learn to see, child. Everything you have learned to do will one day depend on it, because the enemy who comes for the watch will not come as an enemy. He will come wearing something you trust. The sight was unlike every working before it. The light, the wall, the strike, those had been things he did to the world. The sight was a thing he did to himself, a way of looking that had to be unlearned before it could be learned, because the eye had spent 7 years being taught to accept the surface of things, and the sight asked it to distrust the surface, to look at the painted world and refuse, gently and constantly, to believe it. He practiced it on the cupboard first, on the dark he thought he knew, and found the first time it caught that the cupboard was not what he had believed, that there were faint old workings worn into the underside of the stairs. A tracery of silver-gray light he had never seen, protections laid there long ago by a hand he did not know, dim and nearly spent but real, watching over the place his mother's son had been put to sleep. He sat very still and looked at them for a long time and did not ask the book whose they were, because the book had told him not yet about enough things that he had learned to recognize an answer he was not ready for and leave it where it lay. He turned the sight on the house in the days that followed, the way he had turned every working's variables, and the house gave up its secrets one by one. He looked at Aunt Petunia across the breakfast table and saw, under the long-necked surveillance, the old terror laid bare, a gray knot of it sitting behind her eyes 15 years deep, and understood her better in one-sided glance than in 7 years of reading her face. He looked at Dudley and saw nothing hidden at all, which was its own kind of truth. He looked once at his own hand and saw the line, the thread of silver fire the hill had shown him, running up out of the earth and into his own blood, faint but unbroken, the watch laid into him like a wire under the skin, and he took the sight off his hand quickly, because some things are too large to look at over breakfast, and went on being a small boy who had to be told twice to fetch the milk. He was, by the end of that fortnight, something that had not walked the ordinary streets of England in a very long time, a child with a watchman's eye who could strip the paint off the world, and who chose, every single day, to put the paint carefully back and walk through the disguise unremarked. He had learned to be unseen. Now he was learning harder to be the only one who could see. He learned the danger of the sight before he learned its limits, and he learned it from a man at a bus stop, and it nearly cost him the secret he had bled all year to keep. It was a Saturday, the long walk home from the library, and Harry had taken to wearing the sight lightly as he walked, not the full strip-the-paint stare, which tired him and which he had learned to spend like any other working, but a thin steady awareness laid over the ordinary world, the watchman's habit of distrusting the surface even when the surface was only Surrey. The world gave up small things to it. A house with an old half-spent ward worked into its doorstep, 3 streets from Privet Drive, where some forgotten wizarding family had lived a century ago and warded their threshold against he could not guess what. A coin in the gutter that the sight showed faintly wrong, marked once by a working and long since spent. Little ghosts of the old craft scattered through the muggle world like shells in a field a tide had left, none of them alive, none of them watching, all of them safe to look at because the dead do not feel themselves seen. The man at the bus stop was not dead and was not safe, and Harry nearly looked at him too long. He was an ordinary man in an ordinary coat, waiting for the number 19 with a newspaper, and the thin sight slid over him the way it slid over everyone and snagged, caught on a wrongness under the ordinary coat, a glamour, thin and tired but real, a working laid over the man to make him a fraction more forgettable than a man should be. A wizard. A grown wizard walking the muggle world under a small concealment, waiting for a bus like anyone, going about whatever quiet business the wand world had in a Surrey suburb on a Saturday, the first living one Harry had ever seen. And the want rose up in him to look, to turn the full sight on the man, to strip the tired glamour and see what a real wizard of the world he was born to actually was, to learn, to know, the same hungry curiosity that had driven him into the library after a word. He had the working halfway gathered, he had the man halfway in the watchman's eye, and the man's head began slowly to turn. Harry took the sight off him so fast it was like snatching a hand from a flame, and dropped his eyes to the pavement, and walked on at exactly the pace of a bored child going nowhere. And behind him he was almost sure he felt, the man's gaze pass over the back of his neck, mild, searching, the look of someone who has felt the lightest possible touch on his concealment, and turned to find the cause and found only an ordinary boy walking home. Harry did not look back. He turned the corner at the ordinary pace, and only then let his heart do what it had wanted to do for 50 yards, which was hammer. He had nearly made the worst mistake there was. He had nearly told the entire wizarding world in one careless-sighted stare that there was a child in Little Winging who could strip the paint off a grown wizard's glamour, and a child who could do that was not an orphan the watch could leave loose in a cupboard. It was a thing the world would come for at once. The book was grave that night, graver than the near miss alone seemed to warrant, and Harry understood, listening, that he had stumbled onto something the book had meant to teach him slowly and now had to teach him fast. The sight is the watchman's eye, it said, and it is also the watchman's tongue, because a thing concealed is a thing that has set a guard on its own concealment, and a strong enough guard feels the eye that strips it. The dead do not feel it. The spent old wards in the doorsteps will never know you looked. But anything living, anything that holds its own glamour by its own will feel the full sight land on it the way you would feel a hand laid on the back of your neck in a dark room. The stronger the thing, the more surely it feels you. That bus-stop wizard wore a thin, tired concealment and barely felt your half-gathered glance. A strong wizard would have felt the full sight at once. And a thing stronger than a wizard, the gold went still, and what came next, Harry would remember in a wood a season later. A master of concealment, a thing that has worn the unseen so long it has half become it, would feel your sight the instant it touched him, and would know in that instant exactly what you are. So learn this now before it costs you everything. Never turn the full sight on a living thing unless you are willing for that thing to know you have seen it. The eye that strips can be felt stripping. Look lightly, look once, and when you must look hard at a living thing, when the day comes that you have no choice, look and strike, and do not give it the half-second between the seeing and the doing, because in that half-second it will know, and a thing that knows you can see it is a thing that has already begun to plan your death. Harry sat with that and put it where he kept the things he would need and could not yet use, and he changed from that night the way he wore the sight in the world. He kept it thin. He looked lightly, he let the living wrongnesses pass unstripped, the bus-stop wizards and whatever else walked the ordinary streets under their tired glamours, and he never again gathered the full watchman's eye on a living thing out of mere curiosity, because curiosity was the crack the world came through, and he had just felt, on the back of his neck, exactly how the world would come. He did not know that he had just rehearsed, on a forgettable man at a bus stop, the single most important rule of a fight he had not yet been told was coming: look and strike, and do not give it the half-second. He only knew that the sight, like every gift the book had given him, was a blade that cut the hand that held it carelessly, and that he intended, as he intended with all of them, never to hold it carelessly again. He would need it sooner than the book had planned, because the man coming for him had spent a lifetime learning to be exactly the thing the sight was made to catch. Corvin Ash came south slowly, and he came the way a tide comes, without hurry and without stopping. He did not take the wizard roads. The wizard roads were watched, in their lazy way, by the ministry's lazy instruments, and a man of Ash's particular trade had learned long ago that the surest way to be noticed by the institutions was to use the doors they kept their eyes on. He came by the Muggle ones instead, by train, by hired car, by foot, a grey unremarkable man with a grey unremarkable bag, sliding south through the ordinary country with a glamour on him so old and so well worn that it was not a mask he put on but a face he had grown, and no eye in any carriage or café held him longer than it took to forget him. He had worn the unseen so long that he had half become it. It was the irony the book would have appreciated had it known that the thing hunting the watchman was a master of the very concealment the watchman had just learned, the two of them sliding through the same world unseen, converging. He stopped on the way to ask a question of someone who could not refuse to answer. In a damp churchyard on the edge of a town that did not matter, where a particular old grave held a particular old wizard who had died owing Ash a favor and had not been entirely permitted to leave, Corvin Ash knelt in the wet grass at midnight and called up the thin grey remnant of a man named Edrigar Vance, who had been in life an unlicensed dealer in lost things and a scholar of the oldest lore, and who knew even now, even as the bare cold echo of himself, more about the hidden treasures of the first craft than any living soul in Britain. The Book of the Watch, Ash said to the shivering grey thing that rose reluctant out of the grave, It's woken, south of London in a child. I felt it flare 3 weeks past. I want to know what I'm walking toward. The dead thing did not want to speak, and Ash made it, and what it told him in its dry dead whisper turned even Corvin Ash quiet for a while, kneeling in the wet grass. It told him what the book was. Not a grimoire of lost spells to be sold to a collector or bled for its workings, though it was that too, and worth a kingdom as that. It was the watch itself, the post Merlin had laid down, blood-bound to a single line, and it could be held by no hand but the heir's. It could not be stolen, not truly. A thief might carry the closed husk of it away and never wake a single page, the way Ash himself could lift it and hold only dead leather. To have the book, to have its real power, the deep craft, Merlin's own, a man would have to have the blood, or have the child and bend the child and use the child as the hand that opened what no other hand could open. So I don't want the book, Ash said softly to the grave, working it through. I want the boy is the key, the book is only the lock, the boy is the watch, the dead thing whispered, and there was something in the dry voice that might once have been fear, if the dead could fear. Leave it, Corvin. Of all the things you have dug up and sold, leave this one in its hole. The watch is not a treasure. It is a duty, and there is a reason the duty is given only to the hunted and the hard, and there is a thing on the far side of the door it keeps that you do not want to be the man who let in. Walk away. Ash considered the advice with the seriousness it deserved, which to a man of his trade was none, because Edregger Vance had given exactly that kind of counsel in life. Leave it in its hole, about a dozen lost workings that had since made Corvin Ash a wealthy and a frightening man, and a thing every cautious fool tells you to leave alone is, in Ash's long experience, precisely the thing worth crossing a country for. A duty given only to the hunted and the hard, he repeated, and rose from the wet grass and brushed his knees and smiled the smile that was the worst thing about him. And it's been given to a child who's just learned he has more power than the whole sleeping wizarding world, and no one to use it for, and no one to keep him from being used. Edregger, you fool, you've described the easiest mark I've ever walked toward. He turned south into the dark toward Surrey, toward a suburb whose name he now knew. A frightened, lonely, brilliant child, he said almost fondly, is the most biddable creature on God's earth. You only have to be the first person who is ever kind to him. He let the gray dead thing sink back into its grave, and he walked on through the midnight country toward Little Winging, unseen, unhurried, certain, and the only mercy in it, the only thing that stood between Corvin Ash and the easiest mark he had ever walked toward, was that the child at the end of the road had spent the last fortnight learning to see through exactly the kind of man who is the first to be kind to you. 200 miles south, Harry Potter lay in the dark with the watch laid like a wire under his skin and the sight folded behind his eyes, and felt nothing of the man coming for him, because the man coming for him was very good and Harry was still very young. But the book felt it. 3 nights later the Gold woke without his asking and wrote one line across the readied page and held it there this time, did not clear it, so that he read it twice and could not pretend he hadn't. Someone is coming. Learn faster, Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. The secret strains a secret is a kind of weight, and Harry had been carrying his for a year, and the thing about a weight is that it does not get lighter as you grow stronger. It gets heavier because you can carry more, and so you do. The strain came from both sides at once, and he felt it tighten through that summer like a wire drawn from 2 ends. The near side was the house. Aunt Petunia had stopped pretending in the small ways that mattered that her nephew was an ordinary boy. She had not said a word. Saying a word would have meant admitting the thing into her house aloud, but the watching had changed character. It had been the watching of a jailer for an inmate. Now it was the watching of a woman who has heard something move in the walls and lies awake listening for it to move again, and Harry, who could read that kitchen the way other people read a clock, saw the difference and understood the danger in it. A jailer who hates you's stable. A frightened person is not. Frightened people did unpredictable things, talked to neighbors, made phone calls, invited inspection, and the one thing Harry could not survive was inspection by anyone of any kind. Dudley was the immediate problem, because Dudley had not forgotten the alley. He had told the story, of course, the invisible lorry, the sky going white, the cousin standing untouched in the middle of it, and he had told it to his parents in the first hysterical hour. And Uncle Vernon had cuffed him and called it nonsense, and Aunt Petunia had gone the color of ash and changed the subject, and so Dudley had learned, the way children learn, that this was a story that got him hit and got his mother strange, and he had stopped telling it. But he had not stopped believing it, and worse, he had grown, over the summer, a slow, stupid cunning about it. He had begun to watch Harry the way his mother did. He had begun to follow him, clumsily, breathing through his mouth but persistently, and to listen at the cupboard door, and to report in a whining undertone to his mother that Harry was doing something in there. The night Dudley pressed his fat face to the cupboard slats at 2 in the morning, Harry was ready for him, because Harry was ready for everything now. He had heard the floorboard on the landing, the third from the top, the one that sang, and he had the book away and a working on himself before Dudley's eye reached the slats. Not Carol, concealment was for being unseen, and a cupboard that a boy was staring directly into could not be made empty without Dudley noticing the emptiness and fetching his father. Harry did something subtler, the thing he had been refining all summer for exactly this. He arranged the scene. He lay in plain view on the camp bed, eyes shut, breathing the slow, deep breath of true sleep, one arm flung out, an ordinary library book splayed open and face down on his chest where it had obviously slipped from a sleeping hand, and he held the breath and the stillness and the absolute boring ordinariness of it while Dudley's eye crawled over the slats for a long minute, hunting for the impossible, and found a small boy asleep with a book, which was the most disappointing thing in the world, and went away. It worked because Harry had understood the thing the book had taught him in the alley taken to its conclusion. The best concealment was not invisibility, but a better story. An empty cupboard invited questions. A sleeping boy answered them. He gave every watcher exactly the small, dull truth they were hoping not to find, and they took it every time and went back to bed, and the watchman lay still under his face-down library book until the floorboards sang again going away, and then he opened his eyes in the dark and added Dudley's 2 in the morning patrols to the list of things he now had to account for, and adjusted and went on. But he could not arrange every scene, and he knew it, and the knowledge sat in him through that summer as the first real fear he had carried since the attic, not fear of the Dursleys, whom he had outgrown, but fear of the accident, of the one working that slipped. The burst of the old uncontrolled magic that still, even now, even in a boy who could hold a wall with his eyes shut, came up out of him unbidden when he was startled badly enough. The way it had put him on a school roof once and grown his aunt's hair back overnight, the wild magic, the magic that did not ask his permission, that lived underneath the trained craft like a flood under a frozen river and waited for a crack. It cracked on a Tuesday in August, and it nearly ended everything. Uncle Vernon had come home in one of the moods that filled the house like a gas, a thing gone wrong at Grunning's, a contract lost, a humiliation he could not avenge at the office, and so brought home to avenge on the only thing in the world smaller than himself. He found his reason in a smear on a window Harry had cleaned, and he had Harry by the collar against the kitchen wall before the boy had finished saying it was clean. The great purple face an inch away, roaring, and somewhere in the roaring his hand drew back to do the thing it did not usually quite do, and Harry, caught off guard, pinned, 7 years old and for one instant just a frightened child and not a watchman at all, felt the frozen river crack. The kitchen window blew out, not the smeared one. All of them. Every pane of glass in the kitchen burst outward at once with a sound like the sky tearing, a flat enormous crack and a glittering exhalation of glass into the garden, and the kettle leapt off the hob, and the cupboard doors flew open, and the bare bulb overhead flared white and died, and Uncle Vernon screamed and dropped him and fell back against the table with his arms over his face. And for 3 full seconds the wild magic roared up out of Harry uncontrolled, and the kitchen of number 4 came apart around the 3 of them. Then Harry caught it. He had spent a year learning to catch a falling wall before it hit the ground, and he caught this the same way by reflex, the trained craft slamming down over the wild flood like a hand over a mouth, and the roaring stopped, and the glass stopped, and the kitchen was suddenly only a wrecked kitchen, full of evening air and the smell of scorched dust and broken glass winking on the lino, and Uncle Vernon cowering against his own table, and Aunt Petunia frozen white-faced in the doorway. And Dudley wailing on the stairs, and Harry standing very still in the center of it with his collar torn and his heart slamming, and a single cold thought cutting clean through the panic. They saw. There is no story for this. They saw. He did the only thing left. He could not make the glass unbreak or the wild surge unhappen, but he could refuse to be the boy at the center of it, and he had a working for exactly that, the one he had bled for, the one he had told himself he would never use inside the house, because using it inside the house was the act of a thing that had given up on being a child at all. He used it. He looked at his uncle and his aunt and his cousin, and he did not run and did not cower and did not explain, and in a voice that did not belong to any 7-year-old, a voice gone flat and level and very cold, the voice from the alley, he said, "A gas pocket. In the oven. It's dangerous. You should tell people it was the oven." And he reached, as he said it, not for Carol but for something near it, a thing the sight had shown him the shape of, the working that does not hide you but pushes, gently, the listener toward the story you have handed them, that makes the convenient lie feel like their own idea. He pushed it at all 3 of them at once, exhausted, half-broken, with the last of what he had, and he watched it take. He watched Uncle Vernon's face change, watched the purple terror reorganize itself, in the space of a breath, into bluster, into a man who had been frightened by a gas explosion, and was already, even now, rebuilding his dignity around that explicable thing. "Gas," Vernon said hoarsely from the floor. "Gas. I knew that oven was Petunia, I told you, didn't I? I said that oven," and Aunt Petunia, white in the doorway, looked at Harry, and Harry held her eyes, and for one terrible moment the push did not take on her, because she knew exactly what had happened and exactly what was happening now, and the working slid off 30 years of certainty like water off old cloth, and then she made a choice. He saw her make it. She chose the gas, not because she believed it. Because believing it was the only way to go on living in a house with the thing she had just seen, and a frightened person will swallow any lie that lets them keep their life the shape it was. And Petunia Dursley swallowed the gas deliberately with her eyes open, and turned away, and began, in a high cracked voice, to talk about phoning the gas board in the morning. Harry went to his cupboard and shut the door and sat in the dark and shook once all the way through, the way he never let himself shake and then made himself stop, because shaking was a luxury and he had work to do. He had used the deep craft on his own family. He had survived the accident he had feared all summer. And he had learned, at a cost he could feel, the true shape of the danger he was in, that his control was not yet perfect, that the wild flood was still down there under the trained ice, and that one bad enough fright, one cornered enough instant, could crack it again in front of someone he could not push, in a place he could not arrange, and that the wizarding world, whoever was watching it, did not need Dudley's testimony or Aunt Petunia's certainty to find him. It only needed an instrument that could feel a kitchen full of glass blow out at once in a quiet Surrey street, and a man patient enough to come and look. He did not yet know that the instrument existed, or that the man was already on the road. He only knew the strain had a second source, larger and colder than the house, and that night he asked the book about it, and the book told him a thing that turned the strain into something closer to dread. "The world you were born to is watching this house," the book said, "and you have just shouted at it." Harry sat with his back to the warm wall and his hands still not quite steady, and made himself read it slowly. Not closely, the gold went on, not yet. "The wand world is large and lazy, and it believes itself the only magic there is, and it does not watch a forgotten boy in a muggle suburb the way it would watch a threat, but it watches. There are instruments, old, dull, but real, that feel large, uncontrolled magic where muggles live, because such magic risks their precious secrecy more than anything else in their small, frightened law. A boy who blows the glass out of a kitchen has rung a bell, not loudly, not enough to bring them to night. But a bell that has rung once is a bell they will listen for, and you have rung it now twice, the alley and tonight, and the second ringing they will not be able to explain away as a child's stray accident, because a child's stray accident does not happen twice in the same house in one summer. You have a season, perhaps less, before someone in that world decides the bell is worth a visit. Use it. "How do I stop ringing the bell?" Harry said. "You do not blow out any more windows." The dryness was back briefly and then gone. The wild magic is the bell. The craft is silent, a wall, a strike, a concealment done with a trained will makes no sound their instruments can hear, because it is shaped and bounded in yours. It is the unshaped surge that rings, the flood under the ice. So the answer is the answer it has always been: control. Finish mastering yourself. Drive the trained craft down so deep that even a fright cannot crack to the flood beneath it, because the trained reflex reaches the surge first. You are most of the way there. Tonight the surge beat your reflex by a half-second. Close the half-second. That is the whole of your work now, and you do not have a year to do it in, you have a summer, because the world is watching and a man is coming, and the half-second is the gap they will both come through. Harry closed the half-second the only way anything was ever closed, by drilling it, night after night, all that ringing dangerous August, having Dudley's bullies and Vernon's purple face in the kitchen blowing out in his mind on purpose, manufacturing the fright in the safety of the cupboard, and racing his trained reflex against the wild surge, until the reflex won every time. Until the trained ice was so thick and so fast that he could be genuinely startled and feel nothing crack beneath it but a wall snapping up clean and silent where the flood used to roar. It was the hardest discipline of his life, harder than concealment, because it asked him to frighten himself 100 times a night and stay master of it, and he did it because the alternative was a bell rung a third time and a visit. But the book had told him a larger thing inside the small one, and the larger thing kept him awake after the drilling was done. The world you were born to is watching this house. He had known, vaguely, since the library, that there was a wizarding world, the schools, the wands, the ministry the book spoke of with such contempt. He had not, until tonight, understood that it was watching him, that he was a thing it had a quiet eye on, and the moment he understood it, he turned the sight on the question the way he turned it on everything, and the sight gave him an answer he had been walking past for 7 years. He turned it on Mrs. Figg. She was the Catwoman 2 doors down, old and dull and cabbage-smelling. The neighbor the Dursleys dumped him on when they wanted a day at the zoo without him, a boring afternoon of cat photographs and stale cake, the most nothing person on the most nothing street in England. He had never once thought about her, which he realized the instant he turned the watchman's eye on the memory of her, was itself the strangest thing about her, because Harry thought about everyone. He had read every adult in his world down to the gray knot behind their eyes, and somehow the Catwoman 2 doors down had slid past him for 7 years as beneath thought, and a thing that slides past Harry Potter unthought of is not a nothing thing. It is a concealed one. He could not sight her from the cupboard. She was too far and the working did not reach through walls, but he did not need to. He only needed to look with the watchman's eye at the shape of her in his life, at the convenient way she lived exactly 2 doors down, at the way the Dursleys' contempt for her had never quite extended to refusing her, at the cats that watched the Dursleys' garden with that flat, unblinking interest, at the fact that of all the houses on Privet Drive the one boy the Wizarding World had a quiet eye on had been set down a stone's throw from the one neighbor nobody ever thought about. And the shape of it resolved all at once into a watcher. Mrs. Fig was watching him, had always been watching him. Was watching him for someone the way her cats watched the garden, the way the worn old protections under his cupboard stairs watched over his sleep, placed, deliberate, a piece of the same quiet machine. He did not know who had placed her. He did not need to yet. He needed only the fact, and the fact reorganized his whole understanding of his danger. He was not hiding from the Dursleys, who were stupid, and not only from a vague, distant ministry that might one day come. He was hiding, and had always been hiding without knowing it, from his own world, which had set a watcher 2 doors down and wards under his bed, and which believed, wrongly, blessedly wrongly, that the boy it was watching was an ordinary frightened orphan with no more magic in him than the occasional accidental burst. The watcher reported a small, sad child. The watcher must go on reporting a small, sad child. The instant Mrs. Fig's reports changed, the instant the someone behind her learned that the orphan in the cupboard had taught himself the lost craft of Merlin and could hold a wall with his eyes shut, the quiet eye would become a close one, and the close one would become hands, and the hands would take him out of the cupboard, and into the center of the very world he had spent a year learning to be invisible to, and he would never be unseen again. So he gave Mrs. Fig, too, exactly the small, dull truth she was hoping to find. When the Dursleys next dumped him on her, a long gray Saturday of cat photographs while they took Dudley somewhere with rides, Harry sat through it as the most ordinary unhappy child in England, picked at the stale cake, looked at the photographs of Tibbles and Mr. Paws and Snowy with a boredom so total and so genuine that no watcher alive could have read anything under it, and he did not once let the watchman show through the orphan, not in a glance, not in a word. Though he could feel her watching him with the flat, unblinking patience of her own cats, and could have, with a half-second of the sight, stripped the cabbage-smelling glamour off her and seen whatever she truly was, he did not. Seeing her would have meant risking that she felt herself sighted, and a watcher who feels herself seen is a watcher who reports it, and so the watchman sat in a catwoman's parlor and was, flawlessly, for 4 hours, a sad, bored little boy, and walked home having given away nothing, and added a second front to the war he was fighting alone. The book approved, and then it told him the thing that turned the long strain of that summer into something with a clock on it. You have understood your danger, it said, and you have understood it better than I would have dared teach a child your age, and so I will tell you the last of it, because you have earned the right to be afraid of the right thing. The watch is failing. Harry went still. Not failing tonight, the gold said, not this year. But the door Merlin set himself against has been held, this last 100 years, by a line that did not know it held anything, by keepers who never woke me, and a door leaned on by a sleeping man is a door that drifts. The old dark on the far side has not broken through, it is too patient and too slow for that, but it has felt the watch grow thin, the way a tide feels a wall begin to crack, and it has begun in its patient way to press. That is why I woke when I did. That is why I came round, in my own slow turning, to a child with exactly the hardness the watch has always needed. You were not woken to learn pretty workings in a cupboard. You were woken because the door needs a watchman who is awake, and there has not been one in 3 generations, and the things that wait do not wait forever. The strain you feel from the house and the strain you feel from your born world are real, and they are dangerous, and they are nothing, child, beside the strain on the door which you cannot yet feel and which you were made to take up. Learn faster, not because a man is coming, because the watch is failing and you are the only one awake. Harry sat in the dark for a long time with that, and he did not let it grow into the things it wanted to grow into, and he did not break under it, because he had stood on the hill and held a larger thing than this and not broken. But he understood that night that the secret he had carried for a year had never really been a secret about himself. It had been a secret the world was keeping from the world, a watch held by a forgotten boy against a dark that the wand wizards in their lazy schools did not believe in, and that he was the last awake hand on a door that was, very slowly, beginning to give. The Dursleys were nothing, Mrs. Fig was nothing, the coming man, whoever he was nothing. There was a door and it was failing, and he was 7 years old and he was holding it, and no one in the whole sleeping world even knew the door was there. He lay down, he did not sleep for a while, and 2 doors away a catwoman's cat sat on a fence in the dark and watched a darkened house, and reported in the morning, by means Harry could not see, that the orphan at number 4 had spent another ordinary unhappy week, poor mite, no trouble at all, nothing to tell. The strain from the house nearly solved itself in the worst possible way, the week after the kitchen, when Aunt Petunia decided she wanted the boy gone. Harry heard it through the cupboard door late, the 2 of them at the kitchen table thinking the house asleep, Petunia's voice gone high and thin with the thing she would not name. saying that it wasn't natural, that the boy wasn't natural, that she'd put up with it for 7 years for her sister's sake, and she couldn't any more, not after the windows, that there were places, that there were people you could call, that they could be shot of him and no one would blame them, a boy that strange, a boy that much trouble. Vernon's low rumble underneath it, not arguing the point but worrying at the practicalities, the questions, the forms, what the neighbors would say, whether a thing like that left a mark on a respectable family. Harry lay in the dark and understood with the cold clarity that came to him when the world narrowed, that this was the most dangerous thing that had happened to him all summer, more dangerous than the kitchen, more dangerous than the owl that would come the following week. The Dursleys were a known quantity. Their contempt was stable, their cupboard was, in its grim way, safe, 2 doors from a watcher who reported a sad ordinary orphan, under a wall his mother had made, in a house the watch had been left to wait in precisely because it was already safe. If Petunia got her way, if the boy were moved, handed to strangers, processed, inspected, set down somewhere new and unwarded and watched by people with forms and clipboards and a professional interest in why a 7-year-old behaved like a thing carved out of cold, every wall he had would come down at once. The disguise of the unhappy orphan only worked here, in the one place the world had already decided to ignore. Anywhere else someone would look. And Harry could not afford ever for anyone to look, so he could not let himself be moved, and he could not argue, because a boy arguing to stay in the house that hated him was a boy who would be moved out of spite. He had to make the Dursleys decide on their own that getting rid of him was more trouble than keeping him, and he had a working for exactly that, the suggestion craft he had glimpsed the shape of in the sight, the one that did not force a mind but tilted it, that made the convenient conclusion feel like the listener's own idea. He used it carefully over the following days in the smallest possible doses, because the book had warned him that a mind pushed too hard pushes back, and a mind tilted too far feels the hand that tilted it. He did not push them to like him. That would have been absurd, indetectable, and worse than useless. He pushed them in the lightest of touches toward the things they already half believed that happened to suit him. When Vernon worried aloud about the forms, Harry, passing through the room beneath notice, carrying the washing, let the faintest tilt fall on the worry, and Vernon's vague reluctance about paperwork firmed over a day into a settled conviction that the whole business would be a bureaucratic nightmare best avoided. When Petunia fretted about the neighbors, Harry tilted the fret, and it grew into a certainty that questions would be asked, that the Palkises and Mrs. Nextdoor would wonder, that a family that gave up its own orphan nephew would look to the street like a family with something to hide. He never gave them a new thought. He only fed the thoughts they already had that pointed the way he needed them to go, a feather's weight at a time, until the scales the Dursleys were weighing him on tipped, on their own by their own reasoning, toward the conclusion that keeping the strange, ungrateful boy in his cupboard was, all things considered, less bother than the alternative. By the end of the week, Petunia had stopped talking about places and people you could call. Harry heard her tell Vernon, in the flat voice of a woman who has talked herself out of a hope, that it was no good, they were stuck with him. They'd just have to keep him in line, and Vernon agreed, gruffly relieved. A man let off an unpleasant errand, and neither of them ever knew that the thing they were stuck with had spent the week making sure of it, tilting their own fears toward his own survival with a craft neither of them could have imagined a child possessing. It frightened him a little how well it had worked, and he told the book so, because the things that frightened him were the things most worth saying aloud. I made them keep me, he said. I got into how they think and I tilted it. They believe they decided it themselves, and they did sort of. I just leaned on the scales. He was quiet a moment. I could make them do anything, couldn't I, if I did it slowly enough, a feather at a time. I could make them love me even if I wanted, and they'd never know I'd done it. The gold woke grave. You could, it said, and it did not soften it, because the book did not lie to him and would not start now. That is the truest and the most dangerous thing you have learned all summer, and I am glad it frightens you, because the day it stops frightening you is the day you have become a thing the watch should never have chosen. Yes. A mind can be tilted, a feather at a time, until it stands wherever you wish it to stand and believes it walked there on its own. It is the quietest power in all the craft and the one that damns the most keepers, because the strike leaves a body and the body is a question, but this leaves nothing, a mind that does your will and thanks you for the privilege, and no one, not even the mind, ever knows. You used it tonight to keep a roof over your head, and that was need, and I will not blame a cornered child for using the wall he has. But hear me, heir, never use it to be loved. The love you make is not love. It is a mirror you have bent to show your own face, and a watchman who fills his loneliness with bent mirrors will be the loneliest thing that ever lived, surrounded by faces he authored, known by no one, because he never let a single soul arrive at him on its own feet. Make them keep you if you must, never make them love you. The day you are loved, let it be by someone who walked the whole way to you uncompelled, or do not be loved at all. It is the one hunger you must never feed with the craft. Promise me. I promise, Harry said into the dark, and meant it and kept it, and the keeping of that promise would cost him, in the lonely years ahead, more than any working he ever cast or refused, and he made it anyway because the book had asked, and because he understood, even at 7, that a thing was only worth being if it could not also be bent. The owl came on the last Saturday of the summer, and it was the nearest thing to friend Harry nearly let himself want, which was why it frightened him more than the kitchen had. He saw it from the library window at the table where the light was good, a tawny owl in broad afternoon daylight, sitting in the dead butcher's shop sign across the road and watching the library door with the round, unblinking patience of a thing that was not an ordinary owl. Owls did not fly by day. Owls did not perch on the high street of Little Winging at 3 in the afternoon and watch a door. He looked at it over the top of his book and did not move, and the owl looked back, and for a moment he understood that the wizarding world he had learned to hide from had, perhaps, sent a feathered eye to the one place outside number 4 that the orphan reliably went. He did not run. Running was a story. He turned the page of his book and read on, an ordinary boy reading on an ordinary afternoon, and he reached carefully, lightly, with the smallest fraction of the sight, no more than a glance, at the owl to learn what it was. And the instant he did it, the owl's head came round, and its eyes found his through the glass, sharp and sudden, as though it had felt the glance land, and Harry took the sight off it so fast it was like snatching his hand from a stove. A wand-world eye that felt itself sighted by an orphan was a report he could not survive. He had nearly made the worst mistake of his life out of simple curiosity, out of the wish to know the one wild thing that had come to look at him, and he sat very still with his heart going and learned the lesson again, the lesson the summer kept teaching in different shapes. That the loneliness was the danger, that the part of him that wanted to be seen was the crack the world would come through, and that a watchman could not afford to want to be known, not by an owl, not by anyone. When he looked up again, the owl was gone. He never knew if it had been the Ministry's or Mrs. Figg's someone's, or only the smallest, most painful possibility, an owl that a wizarding child somewhere had sent at random, the way they did, that had landed in Little Winging by chance and meant nothing at all. He never knew, and the not knowing was its own weight, and he carried it. He carried it into the library, to the desk, to Miss Pendle, and that was where the summer nearly broke him, not with a threat, but with a kindness. She had a book held for him under the desk, as she sometimes did. She had got better and better over 2 years at guessing what he would want before he asked, and she produced it now, a heavy old thing about the antiquities of Wales, the standing stones and the hill forts and the burial mounds, exactly the kind of thing he had been quietly working toward for a year, and she slid it across the desk to him and said, in the low, even book voice, "I thought of you when this came in." And then she looked at him over the top of her glasses, and she did not look away, the way she usually did, the careful elsewhere looking that had let him take the fat gray book a year ago. She held his eyes, and she said, "You're not all right at home, are you?" It was not a question in the end. It was the thing she had been not saying for 2 years, said at last, in the empty afternoon library with the dust hanging gold in the window light, by the one adult in his world who had ever said his name as if it were a name. And Harry, 7 years old, lonelier than the door he held, looked up into the steady gray eyes of the only person who had ever offered to see him, and felt the want rise up in him so hard and so fast that it frightened him more than the owl, more than the kitchen, more than the coming man, the want to say yes, to say no, I'm not, and there's a book in my cupboard, and a door older than the world, and I'm so tired, and I'm 7, and there's no one at all, the want to be known. For 1 minute by one person before he went back into the dark, he held it at exactly its own size and did not let it grow, and that was the hardest working he did all that ruinous summer, harder than the wall, harder than the half-second, harder than the watchman's eye, to look into the one kind face in his life and put the paint carefully back on himself and lie. "I'm fine," he said. "They're strict, that's all." And he watched the offer close in her eyes, watched Miss Pendle, who was nobody's fool, hear the lie and know it for a lie and understand, with the weary competence of an old woman who had seen a great many children decide they could not be helped, that the door he had just shut was shut on purpose, and that pushing it would only make him run. She let it close. She nodded once and took her eyes off him, kind to the last, and said only, "Well, the book's yours till Michaelmas. Mind the rain with it," and that was all, and it was the most anyone had ever offered him, and he had refused it to keep a secret she would never have believed. And he took the book and said thank you and walked out into the bright ordinary street and let himself feel at once the whole size of the loneliness, the cost of the door, the friend he could not have, and then he set it down, because feeling it twice would have been a thing he leaned on, and the watchman could not lean. He did not see the gray, unremarkable man on the bench across the street, because the gray, unremarkable man did not wish to be seen, and was very good at it. Corvin Ash had been in Little Winging for 2 days. He had taken a room above the shut-down butcher's. The irony of the dead butcher's shop sign, where an owl had perched that afternoon, was not lost on a man who collected ironies, and he had spent the 2 days doing what he always did first, which was nothing visible at all. He walked the streets as a thing the eye forgot. He felt for the small, far heart that had drawn him 200 miles, and found it, faint and careful, and exactly where the alley flare had told him it would be, behind a particular door on a particular street of identical houses, sleeping its careful sleep, waking each gray dawn to do something he could feel as the lightest possible pressure on the old craft and could not yet read. And he watched the boy. He had found the boy easily. A child who hides is still a child, and children have patterns, and Ash had spent a lifetime reading patterns. The orphan went to the library on Saturdays. The orphan walked alone, head down, beneath notice, exactly the small invisible thing a hunted child makes of itself, and Ash, who had made exactly the same thing of himself for 40 years, recognized the disguise from across the street with the warm professional appreciation of a master watching a gifted amateur. The boy was good. The boy was better than good. The concealment the boy wore was real craft, not instinct, and Ash, feeling it, revised his estimate of the prize upward and his estimate of the difficulty not at all, because difficulty to Corvin Ash was only prize by another name. He watched the boy come out of the library with a book held against his chest and a face arranged into careful nothing, and he watched the careful nothing slip for just one instant on the library step, watched a flicker of something cross the small face, a grief, a wanting, quickly mastered, and Corvin Ash, who fed on exactly such flickers, felt the last of his patience reward itself. There it is, he murmured to the empty bench, to the bright ordinary street. There's the way in. You're lonely, aren't you? You're so terribly, terribly lonely, and you're so terribly clever, and you've no one at all to be clever for. He rose from the bench, a gray man the afternoon forgot, and he did not follow the boy. Following was for amateurs, and the time was not yet ripe, but he marked the loneliness the way he had marked the heading 200 miles north, a thing found, a thing to be used. I can be no one to be clever for, he said softly, watching the small figure recede down the ordinary street toward the house with the failing door. I can be the first kind face. It's the oldest key there is, and it has never once failed to turn. He went back up to his room above the dead butchers to wait for the moment and to make his plans, and the plans were patient and clever and very nearly perfect, and they had exactly one flaw, which Corvin Ash had no way to know. The lonely, brilliant, biddable child he intended to befriend had spent the entire summer learning, at terrible cost, that the wish to be known was the one crack the world would come through, and had sealed it against an owl, against a librarian, against his own aching 7-year-old heart. The first kind face that came for Harry Potter now would not find a door. It would find a watchman awake behind the watchman's eye, who had already decided in a library doorway that very afternoon that he could not afford to be seen by anyone, and who would turn the sight the moment a kind stranger smiled at him, on exactly the kind of stranger the sight was made to strip. But that was still to come. That night in the cupboard, Harry read the first pages of a heavy book about the standing stones of Wales by the light of a bead of gold, and did not know a hunter slept 100 yards away. And the book in his hands did not know either, because Corvin Ash was very good at not being known, and the only thing in Little Winging that might have felt him coming, the Aurelian Codex behind the skirting, was turned that night entirely toward the door it watched, and the slow, patient dark that pressed against it, and had no attention to spare for the smaller, nearer hunter who had just arrived to make himself, very kindly, the boy's only friend. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, A Threat Finds Him. The kind face came for him on a Wednesday, by the swings in the recreation ground, and Harry saw what it was before it had finished smiling. He had taken to walking the long way home from the library, not out of pleasure but out of method, varying his route, mapping the angles of his own life, learning which streets had eyes and which did not, and the recreation ground was on one of the routes, a flat municipal nothing of worn grass and a broken roundabout and 2 swings, empty on a gray weekday afternoon. He was crossing the corner of it when a man on the bench by the swings looked up from a newspaper and smiled at him, an ordinary man, gray and tired and gentle, the sort of man who looked as though he might once have been a schoolteacher, and said in a warm and weary voice, "Hard day." It was perfectly done. The voice was pitched exactly to a lonely child, not eager, not interested, just one tired soul acknowledging another, the kind of low, undemanding kindness that asks for nothing and so disarms everything. Any ordinary unhappy boy would have slowed, most would have answered. The opening was a masterpiece of its kind, and Harry knew it was a masterpiece the instant he heard it, because nobody in Little Winging had ever in 7 years spoken to him like that, and a thing that has never once happened does not begin happening by accident on an empty afternoon 3 days after an owl perched on the high street. So he did not slow. But he did not bolt either, because bolting was a story, and instead he did the thing the whole summer had been training him toward without his knowing it would be for this. He turned the sight on the kind, tired man, fully, in the half-second of looking up to answer, and he saw. The glamour was the finest he had ever seen. It lay over the man like a second skin grown rather than worn, a thing of decades, and beneath it, Harry held the sight steady, held his own face slack and ordinary, gave nothing, gave less than nothing. Beneath the tired schoolteacher was something that made the cold go all the way down his spine and stay there. Not a monster. Worse than a monster, because a monster would have been simple. A man hollowed and refilled, a thing that had been human once and had spent so long hunting the old craft and steeping in it that the craft had got into him and changed what he was, and around him, under the kindness, the sight showed Harry a hunger with a heading. A long, patient appetite pointed directly at Harry himself, and under that, deeper, faint, a binding. The man was holding something. Leashed to him, invisible in the ordinary air but plain to the watchman's eye, ran a tether of grey, grave-cold will, and at the end of the tether, somewhere, waited a thing the man kept the way Harry kept the ember, starved and ready. This was the someone the book had said was coming. This was the thing the watchman's eye had been built to catch, and it had just smiled at him from a park bench and asked if he'd had a hard day. Harry took the sight off the man before the man could feel it land. He had learned that lesson from the owl, and he did not make the mistake twice, and in the same motion he became, completely, the thing the man was hoping for. A small, tired, wary orphan, not bolting, not trusting, just a beaten child too cautious to answer a stranger and too lonely to walk quite fast enough away. He let his eyes drop. He mumbled something that was not words. He kept walking at the pace of a child who has been taught not to talk to strangers and half wishes he could, and he felt the man's attention follow him across the recreation ground, warm and patient and certain, and he understood with absolute clarity that he had perhaps days, not weeks, and that the most important thing in the world was that the gray man go on believing he was hunting a lonely orphan and not a watchman who had just looked him in the soul. He gave him the orphan. All the way home he gave him the orphan, and behind the orphan's downcast face the watchman did arithmetic at a speed that would have frightened the gray man badly if he could have seen it. Item, the man was a hunter of the old craft, and he had come 200 miles, which meant he had felt the book, the alley, the kitchen, the daily pressure of the workings, and had come for it. Item, the man had approached as a friend, gently, patiently, which meant he did not intend to simply take the book by force, which meant he could not, which meant Harry turned this over and felt it click into place with the cold satisfaction of a true deduction. The book could not be taken by force. The library had told him as much in the line about the blood-bound treasure that answered to one hand. The man knew it too. The man did not want the book. The book was useless to anyone but its heir. The man wanted the heir. He wanted Harry, wanted to take him, or bend him, or befriend him into opening the deep craft for him, to use the boy as the hand that turned the lock. The kindness was not a way to reach the book. The boy was the book. The kindness was the whole of the plan. Item, and this was the one that mattered. The man believed the boy was a lonely, frightened, biddable child who could be befriended, which meant the man did not know that the boy had sighted him, which meant the boy held the one advantage that mattered in any fight, the advantage Harry had been hoarding his whole life, he knew, and was not known. The gray man was hunting in the dark. Harry was hunting in the light. The gray man thought the game was, can I befriend this child before someone else finds him? The real game, the one only Harry knew was being played, was how do I destroy a master of the old craft who outweighs me by 40 years, without ringing the bell, without being seen, without dying, and it was a far worse game, and Harry had perhaps days to win it, and he was 7. He told the book that night, and for the first time since the attic the book was afraid. He felt it before he read it, a tightness in the warmth of the hide, a flinch in the gold. Describe him, it said, and he did, the glamour and the hollow under it and the gray leashed thing at the end of the tether, and the gold went still for a long moment, and then it wrote a name. Corvin Ash. The script came slow and grave. I had hoped he was dead. He is not a wizard, not any longer, not in the way the schools would mean it. He is a reclaimer, a digger of the old graves, a robber of the watch things, and he has stolen and worn so much lost craft across so long a life that he is closer now to the things he hunts than to the men he was born among. He cannot take me. You are right, and you are clever, and you reasoned it faultlessly. I answer to your blood and no other, and the husk of me is worth nothing to him. He wants you. He will try to take you whole, and if he cannot have you willing, he will have you broken, because a broken hand still turns a lock, and Corvin Ash has broken clever things than a child. The thing at the end of his tether is a grimkin, a hound he has raised out of a grave and bound to his hunger, grave, cold, tireless, and it does not need to see you to find you, it needs only to be told your blood. He has your blood scent now. He felt it in the alley. The hound already knows you. You cannot hide from it the way you hid from the cat woman. Concealment is for eyes. The grimkin has no eyes. Harry sat with that, and the part of him that did arithmetic kept doing it cold and fast, and the part of him that had learned to be afraid of the right things was correctly afraid. Then I can't run, he said, and I can't hide, and I can't let him take me, and I can't fight him in the open because of the bell, and I can't lose because losing is the door. He was not despairing. He was clearing the board, naming the squares he could not use, the way he named the streets that had eyes. So I have to make him come to me, on ground I choose, where the bell can't hear, and where I know every angle and he knows none, and where I can use everything at once and he doesn't know I have it. He looked at the book in the dark. He thinks I'm a lonely child he's going to befriend. I'm going to let him. I'm going to be the loneliest, most biddable child he's ever hunted. And I'm going to lead him kindly, gratefully, one careful step at a time, into the only place in Little Winging I have ever been the most dangerous thing standing in. The gold moved, and the fear in it did not leave, but something else came into it alongside the fear, something Harry had felt from the book only a few times at the attic on the hill, a kind of grim pride, the pride of an old thing watching its heir become exactly what it had waited 1,000 years for. The woods, the book said. The woods, Harry agreed, where I've been breaking trees for a year, where the crows know me, where there's no one to ring the bell and no one to see, and where I have 100 Saturdays of knowing the ground and he has none. He lay back against the warm wall, and his heart was slow, and his hands were steady, and he was 7 years old and planning the murder of a man who had killed cleverer things than children, and he did not flinch from the word, because flinching from the word would not have made it any less the thing he had to do. Teach me, he said, everything you have left. I have days, teach me fast. And the book turned half away from the failing door it watched, gathered the last of its attention back to the boy in the cupboard, and began in the gray hours of the days that followed to pour into Harry Potter the last and the deepest of what it had, not pretty workings now, not the alphabet, but the watchcraft made for exactly this, the craft of a sentinel meeting a thing that should not be, and Harry took it the way he had taken everything, at arm's length, without appetite exactly, and got ready. The courtship took 4 days, and Harry played his part so well that he frightened himself with how easy it was to be loved when you decided to allow it. He let the gray man find him again, the next afternoon, on the same corner of the recreation ground, let himself be found, arranged to be found, walking the route the man now knew he walked. This time he did not mumble and flee. This time he slowed a fraction, the slowing of a wary child whose loneliness has worn a little thinner overnight, and he let the gray man say something gentle and undemanding about the weather, and he answered 2 words, grudging, and walked on. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the first crack in the orphan's shell, exactly the crack the hunter had been waiting for, offered to him at exactly the pace a real lonely child would have offered it, and Harry watched the gray man receive it with a warmth so well counterfeited that a part of him, the part that still, even now, ached for the thing the man was pretending to offer, had to be held very firmly at its own size. Because that was the horror of it, the thing he understood by the second day. Corvin Ash was good at this because Corvin Ash was offering, in counterfeit, the one true thing Harry had wanted his whole life and refused all summer, a kind face, an interested adult, someone to be clever for. The man had read the loneliness off him in a single library doorway and built his whole trap out of it, and the trap was baited with precisely the thing Harry could least afford to want, and Harry had to walk into it on purpose, day after day, letting the want show in measured increments, feeling the gray man's satisfaction grow, and the only thing that let him do it, the only thing that kept the orphan a costume and not a confession, was that he had sighted the hollow under the kindness on the first afternoon, and he never once let himself forget what he had seen. He gave the man a name, Harry, only that, offered on the 3rd day like a frightened gift, and the man gave him one back, Mr. Crow, with a tired smile, and Harry took the false name and did not let his face do anything at all, because Crow Ash, the man, had hidden his own nature inside his alias the way arrogant clever men always did. A private joke at the expense of a child he thought could not get it, and Harry marked the arrogance as a weapon to keep. Because a man who underestimates you out of vanity has handed you the fight. By the 4th day, the gray man trusted the shape of the thing he had built. He suggested gently, idly, that there were better places to talk than a cold municipal park, that he liked to walk in the bit of woodland past the crescent, that it was quiet there, that a boy who wanted to get away from a hard house might like to know a quiet place. And Harry, who had been steering toward exactly this sentence for 4 days the way you steer a heavy thing down a long slope, let his face show the wary flicker of a lonely child being offered a secret of his own, and said, I know those woods. Which was true, and which the gray man heard as the boy is comfortable there, the boy will come, and which Harry meant as I have broken 100 trees there and you have broken none. Tomorrow, then, Mr. Crow said, warm and weary and certain. After your library I'll be there, no need if you'd rather not. The masterstroke, that no need if you'd rather not, the open door that makes the trap thing walk through on its own feet so it never feels the trap. Only if you'd like the company. All right, Harry said, shy, grateful, doomed. I'd like the company. He walked home, a lonely, biddable child, and arrived a watchman, and he did not sleep that night because there was too much to be ready for, and a watchman did not waste the last dark before a fight on sleep he could do without. The book had spent 4 gray mornings pouring the deep craft into him, and he had spent 4 afternoons being loved by the thing that meant to break him, and now, the last night, he laid the whole fight out in the dark the way he laid out everything, and he made the book check his working, because the one discipline he would not abandon even now was the refusal to trust his own cleverness without a second eye. He outweighs me, Harry said, 40 years of stolen craft. If it's a contest of force, he wins, and I'm not going to make it a contest of force. He's a hunter, so he thinks like a hunter. He expects prey, and prey runs and runs predictably and gets cornered. So the first thing he learns in those woods is that the prey doesn't run. The second thing he learns is that the ground does. I've had a year there. I know where the dead birch lines, where the brambles thickest, where the pond is under the leaves so you can't see its water till you're in it. He knows none of it. I make the woods fight him. Every step he takes is a step I chose for him a year ago without knowing it. Good, the book said, and the Grimkin. The Grimkin's the problem, Harry admitted, because pretending a problem away was the surest road to dying of it. It has no eyes, so Carol is useless. It has my blood scent, so I can't lose it. It's tireless, so I can't outlast it. So I don't try to hide from it or outrun it or outlast it. I bind it. He felt the whim in his hands as he said it, the net of wool he had thrown over 100 furious crows. It's a hound on a tether. The tether runs back to ash. A bound thing has a binding, and a binding has a knot, and the sight will show me the knot, and the whim is just a binding thrown the other way. I can't kill it, but I can hold it long enough, and a held hound is a hound that isn't between me and the man holding its leash. And Ash, while you hold his hound, throws everything he has at the child stupid enough to stand still and wrestle a Grimkin, Harry said, and for the first time that night something cold and almost like a smile crossed his face in the dark. Which is exactly what I want him to think I'm doing. The hound isn't the fight, the hound is the misdirection. While he watches me strain to hold his hound, while he's certain he's watching a desperate child make a desperate mistake, the thing he won't see coming is the one thing the sight gives me that he doesn't know I have. He looked at the book. He's a master of concealment. His whole life is being unseen. So his whole life he's never had to fight someone who can see him, see the glamour, see the hollow, see the knot of every working before he casts it. He's going to come at me with 40 years of craft he's used to landing because no one ever sees it coming. And I'm going to see all of it coming, every working, before he finishes the thought, and a strike you see coming is a strike you walk around. The book was quiet a moment, and the warmth of it pressed against the wall, and when it spoke the gold was grave and proud and afraid all at once. You have planned a battle a master would be proud of, it said. And I must tell you the one thing your plan does not account for, because a watchman who is not told the cost goes into the dark believing he can win clean, and no one ever wins this clean. The deep craft I have poured into you these 4 days is real, and it is yours, but you are 7, and your body is 7, and the workings of the watchcraft are paid for out of more than your will. The high workings spend you. Use them and you will win, perhaps, and you will pay in blood and in days of weakness, and there is a working at the bottom of what I have given you that I have not named and will not name unless the moment comes, because it is the working a watchman uses when he has decided he would rather spend everything than lose the door, and I will not have you reach for it lightly. If I name it tomorrow, it will be because everything else has failed. Pray I do not name it. Harry lay in the dark and held that, the unnamed working at the bottom of the craft, the thing the book would only name if he was losing, and he did not let it grow into fear, because fear was a luxury for tomorrow, and tomorrow he would need everything he had. I'll be ready, he said. I know, said the book. That is the part that grieves me. He slept in the end 2 hours because a watchman takes the sleep he can. And in his room above the dead butcher's 100 yards away, Corvin Ash did not sleep at all, because the hunt was nearly done, and he had laid his trap with 40 years of skill. And he lay awake savoring it the way he savored every kill the night before, the lonely brilliant child walking trustfully into the quiet woods, the Grimkin waiting cold in the dark, the long patient appetite about to be fed at last. And he was so pleased with the perfection of his trap that it never once occurred to him to wonder why the wariest, most invisible child he had ever hunted had agreed so easily to follow a stranger into the woods. The woods past Magnolia Crescent took the late afternoon light and turned it green and old, and Harry walked into them ahead of the gray man, into the ground he had chosen, and let the trap close around him because he had built half of it himself. It's peaceful, isn't it? Said Mr. Crow behind him in the kind, tired voice as the last house fell away behind the trees. You can hear yourself think. Yes, Harry said, and led him deeper, along the path he had walked 100 Saturdays. Past the bramble wall he knew was a wall, and the gray man read his scenery, toward the clearing with the lightning-split birch, the ground where every angle was a thing Harry had measured and the man behind him had not, and when they reached it, the clearing where a year of broken trees lay gray and unremarked in the leaf litter, Harry stopped and turned and let his face go still and dropped the orphan. He watched Corvin Ash understand, in the space of a breath, that the hunt had been a hunt from both ends. It was a small thing, the understanding, a flicker quickly mastered of a man who has felt the floor of a certainty move under him, and then the kind tired face simply set aside its kindness, the way a man sets down a tool he is finished with, and what stood in the clearing in the green light was the hollow thing the sight had shown Harry on the first afternoon, no longer bothering to hide. Well, said Corvin Ash, and his real voice was dry and cold and almost delighted. You saw me, on the bench the first day you saw me, and you've been playing the lamb all week. Oh, you clever little thing. He smiled, and the smile was the worst thing about him. Do you know, I think I shall enjoy this more than I expected. It's so rare to find one worth the trouble. Most of them only run. Most of them don't know the ground, Harry said, and he sprang his half of the trap. He had spent the walk in laying it, a working set into the ground at the clearing's edge as he passed, patient, dormant, the way he had learned to set a thing and leave it, and he triggered it now, and the bramble wall that Ash had read as scenery came alive. It was not the brambles. Brambles were only brambles. It was the air between them, a silch turned inside out, a wall not to keep a thing in but to keep a thing from leaving, thrown across the only clear path out of the clearing, so that when Corvin Ash's instinct, and it was the right instinct, the master's instinct, told him in the first half-second that something was wrong and to withdraw and reassess, he turned to go and walked into a wall of held well that should not have been there and rebounded. And for one instant the cold delight on his face cracked into something that was almost respect and almost fear. "You've walled me in," he breathed. "A child, you've walled me into your own killing ground." And then the respect was gone, swallowed by 40 years of a predator's certainty, and he laughed low and dry and said, "But you've made a child's mistake, little watchman. You've put us in a box, and there are 2 of us in your box, and only one of them brought a hound." He loosed the Grimkin. Harry felt the tether snap taut in the sight before he saw the thing arrive, felt the gray grave cold will run out from Ash like a line paying off a reel, and then the leaf litter at the clearing's edge boiled up cold, frost crackling across the wet ground in a spreading ring, and the Grimkin came out of the cold into the green light, and it was worse than the book's words had made it. It was the size of a pony in the shape of a hound, and it was made of grave dark and old frost, lean and wrong-jointed, and it had, as promised, no eyes, only a long blind skull that swung toward Harry and locked, unerring on the scent of his blood, and opened a mouth full of a darkness that was somehow colder than the rest of it, and screamed. The scream went through Harry like the cold going down his spine on the first afternoon, except that it did not stop, and for one suspended instant the 7-year-old in him wanted, very simply, to die rather than be near the thing, and the trained ice slammed down over the wild terror exactly as he had drilled it 100 nights, half a second, one by half a second, and the watchman stood where the child would have fallen, and met the charging grave-cold hound with the only thing that could touch it. He bound it. He had thrown the whim over 100 furious crows, and this was a crow the size of a pony made of grave frost, and the principle was the same, and the cost was 100 times worse. He found the knot, the sight gave it to him, the place where Ash's tether married the hound's bound will, a snarl of gray light at the base of the blind skull, and he threw the binding not over the hound but into the knot, the net of his will closing on the exact point where the thing was held, and the Grimkin's charge died 3 feet from him, its wrong-jointed legs locking mid-stride, its scream cutting off into a frozen rictus. The whole grave-cold mass of it seizing rigid in the air of the clearing the way, a furious crow seized rigid on a branch. The cost of it nearly put Harry on his knees. Holding a crow had been a held breath. Holding the Grimkin was like holding a door against the sea, the thing's bound fury pouring against the net of his will in a freezing flood, and he locked his will around the knot and held, teeth bared, the frost creeping up his own arms, and he had perhaps a minute of this in him, perhaps less, and across the clearing Corvin Ash watched a 7-year-old child seize his Grimkin out of the air by its own binding and went, for the second time, very still. "What are you?" Ash said softly, and it was not a taunt now. It was a question, the question of a man who has hunted lost things his whole life and has just met one he did not expect, and Harry, straining to hold a hound made of grave cold with the frost climbing his arms, gave him the answer cold and level through his teeth, the answer the book had given him on a hill that did not exist. "The watch," Harry said. "I'm the watch, and you came to rob it, and you brought a dog to a clearing full of a year of my work, and now you're going to find out why the watch is given to the hard ones." And while Corvin Ash stared at the impossible child wrestling his hound, exactly as the plan had required, exactly where Harry had wanted his attention, certain he was watching a desperate child make a desperate stand, Harry sprang the last of it, the misdirection inside the misdirection, the thing the man who had never been fought by someone who could see him did not see coming. He had been holding the Grimkin's knot with the whim. He did not need his hands for the whim. The whim was will, and the will was locked on the knot and would hold without his looking at it for the few seconds he could steal. So he stole them. While his held will strained against the hound and his face strained with it, and every line of his body screamed desperate child wrestling a monster, Harry brought up his right hand, low, unremarked, and gathered the tarot, the strike, the clean ugly fist of will he had thrown at 100 dead birches until he could throw it the size of a slap or the size of a sledgehammer, and he gathered it the size of a sledgehammer, all of it, every scrap, and he did not throw it at the hound. He threw it at Corvin Ash, who was watching the hound, and not the boy's quiet hand, and not the strike coming for his chest across the clearing at the speed of a clean thought, because in 40 years of being the unseen hunter Corvin Ash had simply never, not once, had to watch for the thing he could not see coming, and the strike took him full in the center of the chest with a flat, enormous crack that Harry felt in his own sternum, and lifted the master of the old craft off his feet, and flung him the width of the clearing into the lightning-split birch, and the dead tree and the hollow man went down together in a thunder of gray wood. A strike like that would have killed a man. Corvin Ash was no longer entirely a man. He came up out of the wreck of the birch slow and wrong, one arm hanging gray blood at his mouth. and the kindness was gone and the delight was gone, and what was left was the thing the sight had shown Harry under all of it, a hollow appetite that had been hunting the old craft for 40 years and did not intend to be killed by a child in a wood. And it raised its good hand, and it did not bother with a glamour or a feint. It simply reached into the deep stolen craft and tore a working out of the air, and Harry, holding the Grimkin with the last of one will, saw the second working coming with the other eye and had time to do exactly one thing about it. He could let go of the hound and raise a wall, or he could hold the hound and take the working unshielded. He could not do both. He did not have 2 wills left, he had perhaps 1.5, and the arithmetic of it ran through him cold and complete in the quarter-second he had, and he held the hound and took the working because a wall would have saved him and freed the Grimkin, and a freed Grimkin would have been on him before the wall fell, and the only thing keeping him alive was that the hound was still locked in his net and pointed nowhere. Ash's working hit him like the cold of the hound's scream made solid, a grave chill driven into him, into the place behind his sternum where every working was paid for, a thing meant to freeze the will at its source, and it nearly worked. Harry went down on one knee in the leaf litter, the binding on the Grimkin shuddering as his will guttered, frost spreading from his own chest now, his vision narrowing the way it had narrowed the very first morning he had tried to hold a wall for the length of a breath. He had a year of those narrowings behind him. He had drilled the catch 10,000 times, the catch of a falling thing the instant before it hit the ground, and he caught the binding the instant before it failed by reflex, by the muscle the gray hours had built, and held on one knee frost-bitten with perhaps 30 seconds left in the whole of him, while Corvin Ash limped toward him across the clearing to finish it by hand. Harry, the book said, and he felt it more than heard it, the warmth of it reaching him even here, even through the grave chill. I will name the working now, the last one. You can end him with it and the hound and walk out of this wood, and I will not lie to you, it will cost you everything you have and some of what you are, and you may not stand again for a long time, and a watchman who spends everything is a door left unwatched. But you are losing, and I would rather a spent watchman than a taken one. Say the word and I will give it to you. And Harry on one knee, 30 seconds from the end, holding a grave cold hound by its own binding while a hollow man limped toward him to break him, Harry did the thing he had been trained for by a year of gray mornings and a winter of broken birches, and the oldest lesson the book had ever taught him, the lesson of the bruise over the break, of never spending more of himself than the work required. He said no. Because he did not need the working at the bottom of the craft, he had a hound. He had been holding it the whole fight as a weight, a thing to be locked down and survived, and a thing you can hold, the Whim had taught him on 100 furious crows, is a thing you can also aim. The Grimkin was bound, the binding was his now, his net over Ash's knot, the tether between hound and master running gray and taut through the sight straight from the seizing thing at Harry's feet to the limping thing crossing the clearing. He had spent the fight holding the hound still, he stopped holding it still. He took the whole net of his failing will, every scrap, and instead of locking the Grimkin down he reversed the binding, found the knot where Ash's leash married the hound's bound fury, and cut it, and in the same motion threw the net the other way, turned the hound's blind unerring hunger off its lockdown stillness, and onto the nearest living source of the craft that had bound and starved in grave cold, enslaved it for years, which was not the 7-year-old who had merely held it for a minute, but the hollow man who had raised it out of a grave and leashed it to his hunger, and was, at that moment, limping toward it with his guard down and his tether cut and gray blood at his mouth. The Grimkin came unbound, and for one instant it stood free in the clearing for the first time since Corvin Ash had dragged it out of the ground, and then it scented the thing it hated most in all the world, the master, the leash, the hunger that had used it, suddenly unprotected 6 feet away, and it turned its long blind skull toward Corvin Ash, and it screamed, and this time the scream was not hunting Harry. Ash had time to understand. That was the only mercy in it, and it was not a mercy, it was the worst thing. Harry, on his knee in the frost, watched with the watchman's eye as the master of the old craft understood in his last half-second exactly what the child had done, that he had not been fighting to hold the hound at all, that the whole long minute of straining had been Harry waiting, patient as the thing at the foot of the hill, for Ash to limp close enough and lower his guard enough that a cut tether would put his own grave-cold hound between his teeth and Corvin Ash, who had hunted lost things for 40 years and had at last met one worth the trouble, opened his mouth to cast or to curse or to scream, and the Grimkin took him. It was over very fast, and Harry did not look away, because looking away would have been a lie, and the watchman did not get to lie to himself about what his workings did. Then the clearing was quiet, and there was grave frost melting in the leaf litter, and a hound made of cold and dark stood over a thing that was no longer hunting anything, and Harry, with the very last of what he had, did the one working he had left in him, not the whim. He had nothing left for the whim. The simplest thing, the first thing, the thing he had learned in an attic at 6. He made a light. He made it the way the book had taught him to make the ember fire, hungry and growing, and he gave it to the grave cold thing all at once. G-Res opened wide, fire poured into a creature made of frost and old death, and the Grimkin, its master gone and its tether cut and its long enslavement ended, did not fight the fire. It came apart into a billow of cold ash and a last fading scream that was almost, Harry would think about this for years, almost grateful. And then there was nothing in the clearing but a 7-year-old boy on his knees in the wet leaves, frostbitten and gray-faced and emptied to the floor of himself, and the wreck of a lightning-split birch and a stain in the leaf litter and the green old light coming down through the trees as though nothing at all had happened. He could not stand. He knelt there a long time, and the book, behind the skirting 2 streets away, reached him faint and far. It is done, it said, and the gold was so dim he could barely feel it, because it had spent itself too, poured everything into him across 4 days and held nothing back at the end. You want it clean. You want it the way I prayed you would, without the last working, without spending what you are, by being cleverer and harder and more patient than the thing that came for you. Merlin himself did not fight a better fight at twice your age. Rest now. We are both of us spent, you and I, and a spent watch is a watch that must mend before it can keep, and we will both be a long time mending. But the door held, the boy held, rest. But there was one more thing, and the sight gave it to Harry before he could close the watchman's eye, kneeling spent in the clearing where he had just killed a master of the old craft. He looked with the last of the sight at the stain in the leaf litter where Corvin Ash had ended, and through it, behind it, very far away and very deep, he felt the thing the book had warned him of on the hill and in the cupboard, the old dark on the far side of the door, the patient pressure, and it had noticed. The fight had been small and far beneath it, a watchman and a grave robber and a hound in a Surrey wood, nothing to a thing older than mankind, but it had felt the watch wake and fight and win, felt the door's new keeper move for the first time, and for one cold instant, across an unimaginable distance, the patient dark turned a fraction of its attention toward little Winging, toward the spent child in the clearing, the way the watchman on the hill had turned his head. And where the watchman's look had been recognition, this look was appetite, vast and slow and unhurried, a thing noting where its next obstacle had grown up, and filing the place away against a day it had all the time in the world to reach. Then it withdrew because it was patient, and Harry was small, and the day was not yet. And Harry knelt in the cold clearing and understood, spent to the floor of himself, that he had won the fight and that the fight had never been the war, that Corvin Ash had been a thief at the door and not the thing behind it, and that the thing behind it now knew his name and his place and would in its own slow time come, and he did not break under it, because he had stood on the hill and held a larger thing than this. He claned up. It took him an hour he barely had. He collapsed the inside-out silch at the clearing's edge, gathered the residue of the shaped craft and let it disperse, scattered the cold ash of the Grimkin into the bramble where the rain would take it, and did, over the place where ash had ended, a working the book taught him through its own exhaustion, a settling, a forgetting laid into the ground itself, so that the wood would not remember. So that no muggle rambler and no ministry instrument and no owl would ever find a reason to look at a quiet strip of Surrey woodland where nothing, the ground would patiently insist, had ever happened at all. The shaped craft had been near silent, the bell had not rung, a grave robber no one would miss had vanished on a road he had told no one he traveled. There was nothing to find. He had made certain, the way he made certain of everything, that there would be nothing to find. Then he walked home slowly, frostbitten, hollowed, a small gray-faced boy with a library book still in his satchel, and let himself into the cupboard, and slid the spent and dimming book back into the dark behind the skirting and lay down beside it, the two of them emptied and mending, the watchman and the watch, and slept for 16 hours, and the Dursleys, finding him unwakeable the next morning, decided he was sulking and left him to it, and never knew that the boy in the cupboard had the day before. 2 streets away, fought and won the first battle of a war that the whole sleeping world did not know had begun. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, Heir of Merlin, he mended slowly, and the book mended with him, and in the mending the thing between them changed. For a week after the wood he could barely hold a light. The grave chill ash had driven into him, had reached the place behind his sternum where every working was paid for, and it had left that place bruised and slow, so that the simplest welcome of Lumen cost him what a held wall had once cost, and he did not push it. He had learned, of all the things the book had taught him, that the most important was the law of never spending more than the work required, and a spent watch was a watch that had to mend before it could keep. The book had said so dim and far in the clearing, and so Harry, who had wanted nothing his whole life so much as to grow more powerful, spent that week deliberately doing almost nothing, resting the bruised place, letting it knit. Because a watchman who burned himself out at 7 would be no use at the door at 70. The Dursleys, blessedly, helped without knowing it. A boy who slept 16 hours and then moved slowly and ate little and stayed in his cupboard was, to them, a sulking boy or a sickening one, and either way a boy who was not their problem so long as he was quiet, and they left him alone in the one extended stretch of being left alone he had ever been granted, and he used it to heal and was, in the bleak arithmetic of his life, almost grateful to them for their indifference, which for once cost him nothing and bought him exactly the thing he needed. Book in those gray recovering mornings was different. It had spent itself in the wood, had poured 4 days of the deep craft into him, and held nothing back at the end, reaching him faint and far across 2 streets to name the last working he had refused to use, and it came back slowly too, the gold dim at first, the writing slow, the great patient voice quieter than he had ever known it. And in its quiet it stopped, by degrees being his teacher. He noticed it first in the way it answered him. For a year it had taught, had given him workings and withheld them, had refused him things for reaching and rewarded him for stillness, had stood always a little above him, the old thing instructing the small one. Now in the mending, when he asked it a question, it answered him the way you answer an equal. Sometimes it did not know and said so. Sometimes it asked him, turned a question back, wanted to know what he had reasoned before it told him what it held. The distance had closed. He had stood on the hill and held the largest thing there was. He had met a master of the old craft and beaten him clean, without the last working, by being harder and cleverer and more patient. And somewhere in that the book had stopped teaching a student and started keeping company with a keeper, and the change was so quiet that he was a week noticing it, and when he noticed it he did not say anything, because saying it would have made it smaller, and it was the largest gift the book had given him after the craft itself. It had begun to treat him as the thing it had made him. You held back the last working, he said one morning, when the bruised place had knit enough that he could hold a light without paying for it in the old slow coin. In the wood, you offered it and I said no, and you didn't argue, you were glad. I was glad, the book agreed, and the gold moved warmer than it had since before the fight. Do you know why? Because a watchman who spends everything is a door left unwatched. You said so. That is the reason I gave you in the clearing, when you had 30 seconds and no time for a better one. It is true, and it is not the whole truth. The gold moved slow. I was glad because every keeper before you, down the long hill, reached for the last working in their first true fight, every one. They were brave and they were hard, and the watch chose them well, and to a soul they came to the edge and spent everything, because spending everything feels in the moment like the noblest thing a watchman can do, and a watch kept by people who spend everything is a watch that burns through its keepers in a generation and leaves the door again and again to the next unready child. You did not reach for it. You stood at the edge of losing, and you did the colder, harder, less noble thing. You found a way to win that did not cost you what you are. In 1,000 years ere you are the first of the line to understand that the watchman's first duty is not to the fight in front of him. It is to still be standing for the next one. That is why I was glad. That is why I am no longer your teacher. There is nothing left in the lesser craft, nor in most of the deep, that I can teach a boy who already knows the only thing that matters. Harry sat with that in the gray morning, and he let himself feel at once the whole size of it, that the old thing which had found him in an attic and taught him in the dark now looked at him and saw not a student but the keeper of the watch, the equal of the figures on the hill, the first in 1,000 years to be trusted with the whole of itself. And then he set it down out of habit, the old habit of never leaning on a comfort. And then he did a thing he had never done in a year and a half of gray mornings. He picked the comfort back up. He let himself hold it. Because he understood that morning that the habit of never leaning had been a wall built for a different war, built for a boy alone in a house that hated him, who could not afford to lean on anything because everything he leaned on was taken, and that the war had changed and he was not that boy anymore, and there was one thing in the world that had never been taken from him and never would be, because it answered to his blood and no other, and it was warm against the wall beside him. And it had just told him it was glad he could lean on this. For the first time in his life there was one thing in the world he could lean on, and he leaned just slightly, just for a moment, and the book let him, and neither of them said anything about it, because some things are made smaller by being said. All right, Harry said at last, when the moment had been long enough. If you've nothing left to teach me, then there's the other thing, the thing you said on the hill. You have earned the first of the deep workings, the first. There are more. You've been giving me the watch a piece at a time for a year and a half, exactly as much as I could hold, and you held the rest back. Well, he looked at the book in the dim gold light, and his face did the thing it had done in the attic at 6, went still and open, the face of a boy looking at the thing that was wholly his. I beat a master of the old craft in a wood without spending what I am. You said yourself, I already know the only thing that matters, so stop giving it to me a piece at a time. I'm ready for the whole of it, open all the way, show me everything I am. The book was quiet a long moment, and the warmth of it grew against the wall. And when the gold came up across the page, it came up not in the slow, dim writing of the mending week, but in the full flood Harry had not seen since the night of the hill, bright and vast and old, racing to the four corners and leaping the gutter and pouring on, page turning against page, the wind that smelled of cold stone, and a sea he had never seen rising up out of the dark hide and filling the cupboard under the stairs. Then press your hand to me, heir of the line, said the book, the gold blazing, the great voice come all the way back, full and grand and unafraid, and this time I will not show you what you are. This time I will give it to you, all of it. The watch entire, the deep craft whole, the name and the burden and the whole of Merlin's inheritance, into a hand I have watched grow ready across a year and a half of gray mornings and one cold afternoon in a wood. You asked in the attic to be shown a working. You have come a long way from that, boy. Ask now for the whole of your blood, and I will pour the sea into you, because you have grown at last large enough to be the cup. And Harry Potter, 7 years old, the last watchman of a door older than mankind, pressed his whole hand to the book that had been waiting for him since before his country had a name, and asked. The sea came in. He was on the hill again, the bare turf, the gray stone, the deep blue-black sky full of cold silver words turning slowly overhead, but this time the hill was not a thing he had been brought to see. It was a thing he had come home to. The silver line ran up out of the turf at his feet and down the long slope into the dark, and the figures stood along it, the keepers, age on age, receding into depth, and at the very bottom stood the first and tallest of them, Merlin, his back to all his children, holding his door against the patient sea. But the line did not end at Harry's feet this time. He looked down and saw that it ran through him now up out of the earth and into his blood and on, and where before there had been nothing above him, only the dark and the turning words, now he understood that he stood not at the end of the line but at its living edge, the place where the past became the present, where the long silver procession of the dead handed the watch into a hand that was still warm. "Take it," said the sky, and the words that were stars flared in time with the saying. Not the lesson. Not the piece I could fit into a child, the whole. Open and let it in, and do not be afraid, because you have earned the one thing that makes a man able to hold the sea, which is the knowledge of when not to drink it. And the line poured up into him. It came as knowing, the way the first working had come in the attic, complete and without the middle steps. But where the first working had been a single word, a single shape, this was the whole of the deep craft at once. Every working Merlin had laid into the watch against every shape the old dark might one day wear. 1,500 years of a sentinel's craft flooding up the silver line into a 7-year-old on a hill that did not exist. He felt the workings arrive and take their places in him, more than he could ever have learned a piece at a time in 1,000 gray mornings. The craft of binding things that should not be bound and unbinding things that should not be loosed, the craft of mending the thin places in the world, and the craft of standing in them when they could not be mended, the high callings and the deep refusals, the whole sentinel's armory of a line that had held a door since before Rome fell. It was too much. It should have crushed him the way the book had warned a cupped hand is crushed by the sea, and it did not crush him because the book had been right about the thing that mattered. He had learned in a wood when not to drink. He took the sea, and he did not try to hold all of it at the surface at once, did not try to wield it all or know it all or be it all in the instant it arrived. He let it sink. He let it go down into him the way the truth of the hill had gone down a year ago, foundation taking weight, and he held at the surface only what a watchman holds at the surface, the readiness, the eye, the still hand, and let the rest become not a thing he used but a thing he was, a depth under him he could reach into when the door asked it and not before. And at the bottom of it, last to arrive, came the working the book had refused to name in the wood. He understood it the moment it reached him, and he understood, too, why the book had prayed never to name it. It was the watchman's last word, the working a keeper used when the door was failing and there was nothing left and no clever way out, the one that did not strike or bind or conceal but spent, that poured the whole of a watchman's life and craft and self into the door in a single irreversible act of holding, so that the keeper became, for one absolute moment, the wall itself. It was the thing Merlin had done at the foot of the hill. Harry saw now, not died but spent, gone into the stone, become the watch he kept. Every keeper down the long line had carried it, and most had never used it, and a few had, and the few who had were not figures on the hill any more, but lengths of the silver line itself, keepers who had stopped being men and become the thing they guarded. It was the noblest working in the whole of the craft, and it was the one the book had been most afraid he would reach for, because a watchman who reaches for it has decided to stop being a watchman, and the line did not need another length of silver. It needed a keeper who would still be standing in the morning. "Now you hold it," said the sky, grave and proud and unafraid. "And now you understand why I would not name it in the wood, and why I was glad you did not ask. Carry it. Carry it your whole life and never use it if the watch is kind to you. It is not a weapon. It is the last door, and a keeper opens it once, and only when every other door has failed, and you will know, if that day ever comes, you will know, because you will be the only thing left between the dark and the world, and you will have made already the choice to be the wall. Until that day it sleeps, let it sleep. The watch is not kept by those who long to spend themselves. It is kept by those who would rather not and stand anyway." The hill held him a long moment, the silver line running through him into the turning dark, the keepers receding down the slope, and at the very bottom Merlin turned his head just slightly, just enough, as he had a year ago, and looked back up the long procession of his blood at the last of them, the small one, the one who had taken the sea and not drowned, and this time the look that landed across 15 centuries was not only recognition. It was something a watchman almost never gives and almost never gets, the rarest thing the hard ones have to give each other, and Harry felt it land and held it at exactly its own size, and did not let it break him, because it would have if he had let it. It was welcome. One watchman to another, down 1,500 years of holding a door alone in the dark. You are one of us now, and you are not alone, because we are all of us here, the whole line, holding with you, and you will never again hold the door by yourself even on the night you think you do." And then Merlin turned his face back to the door, because a watchman does not look from the door for long, and the hill began to fade, and the sky full of words drew down and down into a single page. Harry Potter knelt on the floor of a cupboard under a staircase in Surrey with his whole hand pressed to a closed book, and he was 7 years old, and he was the heir of Merlin entire, the watch hole in him. The deep craft sunk into him like a sea under ice, the last door sleeping at the bottom of him where he would, with any kindness from the world, never have to wake it, and he took his hand off the book and sat back on his heels in the dark, and for a long time he did not move. He was not crying, because crying was a thing that happened to boys who had someone to cry to, and he understood now, finally, something better than someone to cry to. He had a line. 1,500 years of the hunted and the hard, the orphans and the freaks and the boys in cupboards, every one of them given a door to hold and a craft to hold it with, and no one in the sleeping world to thank them. All of them standing along the silver line that ran through his own blood, holding with him, so that the loneliness that had nearly broken him in a library doorway was, he saw now, the one thing about his life that had never been true. He had been told he was alone since the day a basket appeared on a doorstep. He had believed it for 7 years, and it had been a lie the whole time, the largest and the kindest lie the world had ever told him, because the boy in the cupboard had never once been alone. He had simply not yet been large enough to see the company he kept. He let himself feel it. The whole size of it once, all the way he had let the warmth in smallness land, and the weight of the hill land, and the cost of the wood land. He let the not being alone land, and it was larger than any of them, and he held it, and he did not break, and then he did not set it down. He kept it. It was the first thing in his life he had ever decided to keep at the surface and lean on, and he kept it, because a watchman who knows he is not alone is a watchman who can hold a door a great deal longer than one who thinks he holds it by himself, and Harry intended to hold his door a very long time. He went to the library that Saturday to return the book about the standing stones of Wales, and he found that he could, for the first time, accept a kindness without it cutting him. Miss Pendle was at the desk, gray cardigan and glasses on their chain, and she took the heavy book back and turned it over in her hands the way she turned every returned book, checking its corners, and she said, on time and not a mark on it, "You're the only one under 40 who brings them back the way they left." It was not quite praise. Miss Pendle did not deal in quite praise, but it was the thing she said instead, and Harry, who had spent 2 years unable to receive even that much without the wanting rising up in him like a danger, found that the wanting did not rise. It was not gone. He noticed that with the watchman's habit of noticing everything in himself, the loneliness was still there, would perhaps always be there, the cost of the door he kept. But it had stopped being a wound that any passing kindness could reopen, because the thing the wound had been about, the conviction that he was alone, that no one had ever held him without wanting him smaller, that there was no one and never had been, had turned out to be the one lie the world had told him that was not true. He had a line. He had a wall his mother had made of her own spent life. He had a book that answered to his blood and no other, and had told him it was glad. The library, the gray woman, the small, dry, not quite praise, these were no longer the only warmth in a cold life, the unbearable glimpse of a thing he could not have. They were small extra warmth on top of a warmth he already carried, and a boy who is already warm can stand near a fire without aching for it, so he let himself have it. He said, "Thank you for keeping it for me," and he meant the standing stones, and he meant 2 years of books held under the desk, and slips written without comment, and a name said as if it were a name, and Miss Pendle, who was nobody's fool, heard the whole of what he meant under the small polite words, and looked at him over the top of her glasses with the clean attention she gave to live things. "You've changed," she said, not a question. An observation made by a woman who had watched him across 2 years of Saturdays. "Last year you came in here like something that expected the roof to fall. You don't now. I don't know what's happened to you, Mr. Potter, and I've learned not to ask because you'll only tell me you're fine and they're strict, a ghost of dryness. But whatever it is, you stand like you found something. I'm glad of it. A boy ought to have one thing that's his." Harry looked at her, the one adult in his world who had ever offered to see him, and he understood that she had in her way seen him after all, not the watchman, not the craft, not the door. She would never know about those, and that was as it must be, but the truer thing under all of them, the simple fact that the starved child who had come in expecting the roof to fall had found, somewhere in the dark, one thing that was his and had stopped being starved. She had read it off him the way he read everyone, down to the gray knot behind the eyes, except that what she had read was not a knot but its loosening, and she was glad of it, this old hard woman who owed him nothing, glad in the plain uncomplicated way of a person who simply likes to see a child stand straighter than it used to. He could have lied. He had lied to her before in this room to keep a secret she would never have believed, and the lie had closed a door in her kind face and he had let it close. He did not lie now. He did not tell her the truth either. The truth was a door older than the world and not hers to carry, but he found, between the lie and the truth, a third thing, the thing he had learned to build his whole life out of, a true plank with the gate left where he wanted it. I have, he said, found something, one thing that's mine. They can't take it, and that was true, all of it, every word, and it gave away nothing, and it let the kind gray woman have the small, real gladness she had earned across 2 years of Saturdays, and it cost Harry nothing he could not afford, because he was warm now, and a warm thing can give a little warmth away. Miss Pendle nodded, satisfied, and slid a new book across the desk to him. She had one held ready. She always did, and this one was about the kings before the kings, the old British ones, the ones who came before the histories, exactly the dark old corner he had been working toward, and she said, "Then you'll want this." Mind the rain, and Harry took it and said he would, and walked out into the bright ordinary autumn street with a book under his arm and a warmth in him that no passing kindness could open, and no Dursley could reach, and no master of the old craft had managed to take. He did not turn the sight on Miss Pendle, then or ever. He had wondered once whether the one adult who had ever been kind to him was kind by chance or by design, whether she too was a piece of some watcher's quiet machine, and he had decided deliberately never to look, because some kindnesses you do not strip the paint from, not because you cannot bear the truth, but because the not knowing is the last small ordinary thing you have, and a watchman who cites every gift he is given will end by trusting nothing. And Harry had decided he would rather keep one unexamined kindness in his life than be certain of its grounds. He let Miss Pendle be exactly what she appeared to be, an old woman who liked a boy who read. It was the one place in all the world he chose not to see clearly, and he chose it on purpose, and it was in its way the most powerful thing he did all year. In the weeks that followed, he took the measure of what he had become, the way he had always taken the measure of everything, by careful test. He did not throw the new craft around. A lesser boy with the deep workings of Merlin sunk into him would have wanted to feel them, to break something large and grand and be sure the power was real, and Harry felt the wanting and held it at its own size and did the colder thing, which was to learn the new craft the way he had learned the old, in the gray hours, in the dark, exactly, spending no more than the test required. He found that the workings were there when he reached for them, sunk deep, vast, more than he could ever hold at the surface at once, and that the reaching cost him almost nothing now, because he had stopped trying to wield the sea and learned to draw from it a cupful at a time. He could mend a thin place in the world. He tested it on the worn old protections under the stairs and felt, in the testing, how a watchman closed a gap the dark might press through. He could stand in a place the craft had failed and hold it with his own will. He tested that too, briefly, and understood that this was the heart of the watch, the thing the door would one day ask of him. He was at 7 more dangerous than any wand wizard the sleeping world could field against him, and the measure of how far he had come was that the power did not make him want to use it. It made him quieter, a boy with nothing to lose shouts, a watchman with a door to hold learns to be still. He turned the full sight at last on the thing he had walked past for a year, the worn protections laid into the underside of his own stairs, the dim tracery of silver gray he had glimpsed the first night he learned to see and had been careful never to look at too closely, because the book had taught him to recognize an answer he was not ready for. He was ready now. He looked with the whole of the watchman's eye, and he saw what had been keeping watch over his sleep for 7 years, and it stopped his breath. It was not the book's craft, and it was not the wizarding world's. It was older and simpler and far more powerful than either, a working not built but grown, the way Corvin Ash's glamour had been grown rather than worn, a protection laid into the very walls of the house by an act of will so total and so final that it had not faded in 7 years, and would not fade in 70. And the sight showed him, as it showed him everything true, the shape of the will that had made it, and the shape was a woman, and the woman had made it out of the only material that makes a working like that, which is a life given up on purpose for the thing it shields. His mother, the green flash in the West Country, had not only ended her. It had spent her the way the last working spent a watchman. She had stood in a thin place between the dark and her sun and become, for one absolute irreversible moment, the wall, exactly as Merlin had at the foot of the hill, exactly as the working sleeping at the bottom of Harry's own blood would one day let him do. And the wall she had become had been carried here, into this house, into these walls, and had kept watch over the boy in the cupboard every night of his unloved life. The one warmth in the cold house that had never once been the Dursleys. Harry knelt under the stairs and looked at his mother's last working with the watchman's eye, and he understood that he had been wrong in the attic about which gift mattered. He had thought the book was the gift, and the proof was worth more than the gift. He had been a child. The gift had never been the book. The book was a post, a duty, a door to hold. This was the gift, this warmth grown into the walls, this wall a woman had made of her own spent life and left wrapped around a basket on a doorstep, and it had been there the whole time, over his head every night, while he told himself in the dark that no one had ever held him without wanting him smaller. Someone had. Someone had held him so completely that she had become the holding, and gone on holding him for 7 years after she was gone, and the watchman, who could now see it, knelt under the stairs in the dark and let himself feel it once all the way, the largest of all the things he had let land, and held it and did not break and kept it, beside the other thing he had decided to keep, the not being alone, because they were the same thing in the end. He had never been alone. He had only not been able to see the company he kept. He did not tell the book what he had seen. Some things are made smaller by being said, and this was the largest of them. But the book knew, the way it knew most things, and it said only, "One gray morning you found her," and Harry said yes, and the book said, "She's why the watch could be left here in a muggle house, unguarded. No old dark and no reclaimer and no ministry could reach you behind a wall like that. They set me in the attic because she had already made the house safe enough to wait in. They knew what they were doing, your mother and father, better than even I understood. Be worthy of it," and Harry said, "I intend to be," and that was the whole of what was said, and it was enough. Then he turned with the full sight and the full craft and the whole of who he now was to the only question left, which was the question of the world, because the war had not ended in the wood. He knew that. Corvin Ash had been a thief at the door, and the thing behind the door, the patient dark, the old pressure older than mankind, had noticed him now, had turned a fraction of its vast slow attention toward a Surrey clearing and marked the place where its next obstacle had grown up. It would come, not soon, it was patient past human reckoning, and he was small, and the day was not yet. But it would come in its own slow time, and when it came the watch would have to be kept by someone awake and ready and strong, and there was in all the sleeping world exactly one person who knew the door existed and one person ready to hold it, and they were the same 7-year-old boy in the same cupboard under the same stairs. So the question of the world was not, when do I let them find me? It was, how long can I keep them from finding me, and what do I become in the time I buy? And Harry, who had spent a year and a half answering exactly that question against the Dursleys and the Wizarding Watch and a master of the old craft, knew his answer before he finished asking it. He would stay hidden. Not because he was afraid, he had outgrown being afraid of the things hiding had once protected him from, but because hidden was the strongest place a watchman could stand, and Harry had learned, across a year and a half in the dark, that the strongest place was the only place worth standing in. He laid it out for the book one last gray morning, the way he laid out everything, because the one discipline he would never abandon was the refusal to trust his own cleverness without a second eye, even now, even as the equal the book had named him. "The wizarding world will come for me," he said. "Not yet. There's a school in the north, you've mentioned it, the long white beard at the head of the table. They take children at 11. A letter comes. I've read enough of the old stories to guess the shape of it. At 11, the orphan they've had a quiet eye on his whole life gets a letter, and an envoy, and a door opened into the world they think is the only world there is. That's 4 years from now. 4 years where the watch over me stays loose, because the cat woman 2 doors down still reports a sad ordinary orphan, and the someone behind her still believes the boy in the cupboard is exactly what they left here, small, frightened, untaught, no more magic in him than the occasional accidental burst. Good, let them believe it. Every month they go on believing it is a month I grow stronger in the dark with no one watching closely, and a watchman wants nothing in the whole world so much as time the enemy doesn't know he's using. And when the letter comes, the book asked, when they open the door and the envoy arrives and the world you were born to reach is in at last to take its orphan, then they'll find an orphan," Harry said. "That's the whole point. They'll find exactly the boy they're expecting, small for his age, raised hard, blinking in the light of a world he's never seen, a frightened nobody from a cupboard who can barely believe he's a wizard at all. I'll give them that boy. I'll give them that boy for as long as it serves me, the same way I gave Aunt Petunia the splinter and Corvin Ash the lonely lamb, a fence built entirely out of true planks with the gate exactly where I want it. They'll think they're teaching the heir of Merlin his first spell." Something cold and almost like a smile crossed his face in the gold light. "And the whole time, underneath the orphan, there'll be a watchman who learned the lost craft of their own founders, founder in a cupboard before he could spell his name, who beat a master of the old craft in a wood at 7, who holds a door they don't believe exists against a dark they've forgotten how to fear. They'll be so busy congratulating themselves for rescuing the poor Potter boy that not one of them will think to ask what the poor Potter boy taught himself in the dark while they weren't watching. And by the time any of them is clever enough to ask, and one of them will be, the long white beard sees more than he says, by then I'll have decided on my own terms in my own time exactly how much of what I am I'm willing to let the world see, and not 1 inch more." The book was quiet a long moment, and the warmth of it pressed against the wall, and when the gold came up, it came up warm and proud and old. "You have planned the next 4 years of your life," it said, "the way you planned the wood, and the way you planned the wood was the way Merlin planned the holding of a door for 1500 years, patiently and from the place no one is looking, and giving the enemy exactly the small, dull truth he is hoping to find. There is nothing left for me to teach you, heir. There has been nothing left for some time. We are only company now, you and I, a watchman and his watch, mending in the dark, growing toward a war the world does not know has begun, It is the oldest arrangement there is. I am glad, after 1,000 years, to keep it with you." "So am I," Harry said, and meant it, and kept it. Sat back against the warm wall in the dark of the cupboard under the stairs, the book beside him, his mother's wall above him, the silver line of 1,500 years of the hard and the hunted running through his own blood, and he was 7 years old, and he was the heir of Merlin, and almost no one in the whole wide sleeping world knew he existed at all. Outside, Privet Drive went about its morning. Uncle Vernon's car coughed and pulled away toward Grunning's. Dudley thundered down for his breakfast. Aunt Petunia's slippers found the lino, and her long neck turned, out of 7 years of habit, toward the cupboard under the stairs where the useless boy slept, and she felt as she had felt every morning since a summer the windows blew out, the small cold draught of a thing she would not name living in the walls of her house, and she pressed it down and went to fill the kettle and did not knock on the cupboard door, because some mornings she let him sleep now, out of a fear she would have died before admitting. And inside the cupboard, in the dark, the boy she would not look at raised his left forefinger before his face, the one that had bled a single drop onto a blank page in an attic 1.5 years and a lifetime ago, and remembered the gray gold light, the very first working, the one that had answered him when nothing in the world ever had, and welcomed it back. It came at once. Steady, gold-white, obedient, a thing he had called out of nothing in the dark when he was 6 and alone and had nothing, and which had never once failed him since. It lit the underside of his mother's stairs and the warm dark hide of Merlin's book and the still, open face of a boy who had been told all his life that he was nothing and had taught himself alone in the dark that he was the watchman of the world. He held the light a long moment. Then he closed his hand around it gently and put it out and lay down in the dark to wait for the letter, for the world, for the war, for the day the door would ask everything of him and he would be ready, because he had decided in an attic at 6 that he would be, and he was not afraid, and he was not alone, and he was at last exactly where he had always meant to stand, unseen and ready in his own. The watch held, it had always held. And now, for the first time in 3 long generations, it was kept by someone awake. Chapter 7 end.